The river at Brazos Bend has a way of making you feel like you've stepped into someplace older than you. Not just old in years, but in memory, like the air remembers things people shouldn't know. At night, the water barely moves, black and still, reflecting scraps of moonlight through the moss and cypress. It's a place where sound carries strange, where the crunch of gravel underfoot feels heavier, like each step is dragging a weight. That's what the campers by the bank learned when the footsteps began. They had been fishing long past midnight, lantern hissing low, cooler half full of catfish and crappie. The quiet was the kind you only get deep in the park, far from the road, where even the crickets seem cautious. Then they heard it, slow and deliberate, boots grinding against gravel behind them. At first they thought it was another late wanderer, maybe a ranger on patrol. But when they turned, lanterns held high, there was no one there. Just the wet prints leading away. The imprints of boots pressed into the dirt and shining with river water as if someone had walked straight out of the Brazos and onto the bank. They laughed it off at first, as tired people do when the strange presses in on them. Maybe one of them had stepped wrong. Maybe it was nothing more than a trick of water on rock. They baited lines again, forced the laughter, yet their eyes kept drifting back to where those wet boot marks darkened the soil. When the noise came again, closer this time, right behind their shoulders, they spun fast enough to spill tackle boxes and lantern fuel. But the bank lay empty. No figure, no face, only more wet footprints that led down into the black current and vanished under the surface as though the river had swallowed someone whole. Sleep didn't come easy after that. They packed up, muttering about drunks wandering the trails, but the prints still glistened at the edge of the water. The night felt like it had lengthened, stretching hours out thin, and the walk back to the campsite twisted longer than it should have. Every few minutes, just as their nerves settled, that sound rose again. Boot soles grinding, gravel shifting, always right behind them, never seen. They shone their flashlights into the trees along the trail, into the grass where fireflies sparked faint yellow. Nothing. But when they lowered the beams, the prints were back, damp and clear, overlapping their own tracks as though something unseen walked with them step for step. By the time they reached their tents, none of them were talking. Their silence was the kind that comes from a shared knowing, an agreement they couldn't put into words. The air was thick with river smell, damp earth and old decay, and they swore they heard the slosh of boots moving between the tents even as they zipped themselves in tight. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of water closing over their faces, of being dragged into the silt by hands they couldn't see. In the morning, the prints were still there, circling the tents leading back toward the river. The ground inside one of the coolers was soaked through, as though someone had lifted the fish out with wet hands, leaving behind only scales clinging to the ice. No raccoon could have opened the latch. No thief would have taken only what belonged to the water. When they checked the lines still set on the bank, they found them snapped clean, ends slick and frayed, as if something strong and unseen had yanked them down deep into the current. That was the last night some of them ever camped near Brazos Bend. But the stories lingered, passed around campfires and whispered at bait shops. They say if you sit by the river past midnight and listen close, you'll hear those heavy boots again, slow and steady on the gravel. They say the footprints always glisten wet, even in drought, and they never lead away from the water, only into it. Some claim the boots belong to a fisherman who drowned decades back, dragged under by his own line, lungs filled with mud. Others swear it's older, something that wears the shape of a man but never was. Whatever it is, if you hear it behind you, don't follow the prints into the dark, because the Brazos has a hunger that doesn't let go, and those footsteps are only ever leading one place, back into the black water, where the river waits with open arms. They say every park has one spot that feels wrong in daylight and worse at night. In Huntsville State Park, it was the picnic table tucked near the line of loblolly pines where the ground dips toward Lake Raven. The top looked like every other table in the day, splintered from barbecue smoke and summer storms, carved with initials and the dates of family reunions. It had a permanent grease shadow no amount of rain could wash out, a rectangle where a portable grill had once burned long enough to blacken the grain. People ate lunch there and set diapers there and forgot sunscreen there and never mentioned it again. Then night came down, and at 2 a.m, without hands, you could see the table set itself. I knew because it was my job to drive the loop after midnight. The park hired me as a seasonal ranger after I aged out of a run of bad luck. I told them I liked quiet, and they believed me. Most nights I rolled slow past the boat ramp and the screened shelters, checked bathhouse doors, shined a light into the trees to see the tiny bright eyes of raccoons waiting for someone to leave a cooler unsecured. The lake held a dull glow under the sky of the prison town. Even if you never looked toward the red brick walls on Avenue 1, you felt Huntsville, the weight of all those gates and rows of razor wire. The first time I saw the table set, I thought it was campers being cute. Tin plates, heavy forks, no food. 4 places, always 4, arranged with a military neatness that didn't match any family I'd ever seen. I took the plates back to the ranger station and they were there again the next night, waiting the way dew waits. The third night I took the plates at midnight and sat in the truck with them. And at 2, without fail, the table had 4 more, and the ones in the truck clinked against each other like they were restless inside the cardboard box. I could have told my supervisor, but there are kinds of trouble you learn to keep to yourself. He would have called it a prank and given me more work. I took photos with my phone and they looked like a Boy Scout project. It was only when I leaned down and angled my head to the right and squinted that I caught it in the camera's reflection. Not hands exactly, not even shapes, but a wavering dark, like breath over a mirror. The flash put a pale slick on the silverware, and there was the faintest suggestion of names etched into the spoon bowls like someone had worried at them with a needle. On the 5th night, a breeze came out of the pine line carrying something that wasn't the lake or the sweet chemical tang of bug spray. It smelled like burned bread. I thought of toast scraped black and left too long. I stepped closer and caught the letters stamped on the underside of a fork, TDCJ. I knew what that was. A lot of people in Huntsville know what that is, even if they never want to pronounce all the syllables. Texas Department of Criminal Justice. The state sells or scrapes old inventory, and it ends up in restaurant surplus lots and church kitchens. There are 100 ways a piece of issued steel can wander from one place to another and forget where it came from. I put the fork down, and that's when the whispering started. I don't mean wind. The wind in the pines is a clean sound, a soft static that lives at the top of the trunks. The whispering came from table height, like 4 pairs of voices not speaking to each other but speaking to me at once. Stay for supper, they said, except they didn't. Each voice said it in its own way. One sounded like a mother older than memory, sweet and tired. Another had a rust in it like a man with a sore throat recovering from winter. A third was a child's cadence repeating what it had heard. The 4th voice whispered like it had only partial lungs and was trying to make the most of what was left. My radio hissed and then went dead. The little digital clock on the dash that always blinked 5 minutes slow correct to nothing. I stood, because I am a dumb man like that, and leaned one hip against the table like I belonged there. The whispering softened. The plates gleamed, new and not new. I lifted one, expecting paper light or flea market weight. It felt heavy as a stone. On the bottom, scratched in, was a series of numbers and the name Lewis. I put it back down and traced the black scorch that ran the length of the tabletop and felt heat. Not present heat, but a memory of it, like when you touch concrete after the sun has been gone an hour. Stay for supper, said the child voice, only now I realized the child was wrong. Not a child. A woman doing a child. The rhythm was off. The other voices hummed agreement the way people do when you make a suggestion they've already decided on. I backed up and the whispering grew quick, and the wind from the pines bent toward me, and the heavy quiet of the lake lifted like something rising to check me out. I drove the rest of that loop too fast and through gravel where the road met the highway. In the morning, the park looked like it always does. Dog walkers at the trailhead. Coffee steam in the air. A bass boat scraping against the aluminum rails at the ramp. I told myself it wasn't my business. Ghosts were for teenagers and YouTube channels and couples who wanted an excuse to grab each other in the dark. Then a man checked into a tent site not far from the table. He had the look of a person who lived out of a bag even when he had an address. He asked if there were quiet spots to fish at night, and I told him to stick to the pier. He smiled without showing his teeth and said he liked the shore. I told him about alligators, and he nodded like he'd be happy if one solved his problems for him. His name on the reservation was Bo, which could be a name or just the first 2 letters that were all he could bear to give. I saw him at sunset on the curve of the water where the ground turns from pine straw to sticky black clay. He had a lantern, the old kind, and a cheaper one on a string. He had a thermos and a small radio playing country that sounded 30 years old. I drove by again at midnight and the radio was off. He was facing the water, but his shoulders were turned toward the pines. When I rolled my window down to tell him about quiet hours, I heard it. Faint but sure, the same set of voices. "Stay for supper," said the wrong child. "Stay for supper," wheezed the broken lung. "Stay for supper," sighed the tired mother. Bo kept his eyes on the lake and nodded like a man hearing a song he didn't want to, but couldn't stop from getting stuck in his head. At 2, the table was set the way it always is. The plates were different, but the arrangement was the same. 4 places, no knife at one setting, as if someone didn't trust whoever would sit there. The 4 candles pointed at me like compass needles. The voices grew stronger. I made a choice I wish I had avoided. I sat, the wood was warm. The warmth came up through my jeans into my thighs in that way that makes you think human hands have been there just before you. The whispering moved like smoke past my ears, close and then a step back, then close again. "Stay for supper," said a voice that was so much like my mother's I flinched hard enough to bump the table. She died in an apartment in Conroe in a July so hot the air conditioner dripped itself to death. She used to feed anyone I brought through the door. She had one good pot and made it work. That voice was not hers, but it took her shape and wore her shoes across my mind. The wheezy voice breathed in and out like it hurt and said the same words. The wrong child giggled and said it again. The calm voice spoke last, like it might be a man in a pressed shirt leaning on a counter. "Stay for supper." Not please. Not a request. A command dressed as hospitality. I put my hands in my lap and told the empty air I'd already eaten. The wrong child voice said, "Not yet, you haven't," and something cold touched my knuckles. I stood up so fast the bench scraped. The bench scraped, but there was no mark. The plates rang between themselves, 4 soft notes. In the trees, a barred owl asked, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all?" and the lake made no reply. My radio ticked back on and I called in a maintenance issue because I needed to say something to someone living. In the morning, Bo's tent sat with its flap open like a mouth. No one inside. His thermos stood on the picnic table by his fire ring. The regular kind, not the one by the pines. His lantern hung on a branch, dead. On the ground near the pine table, there were footprints without tread, the old kind of boot that leaves a smooth oval. They came up from the lake and stopped at the table. They didn't go back down. The plates were gone. I checked the cardboard box in the station and it was empty. My supervisor asked why I was in early, and I told him a tent was vacant. He said leave a note and give it until noon. By noon, a woman called from a number in Walker County and asked if anyone had seen her brother. She said his name wasn't Bo, but people used to call him something like that. She cried without sobbing and said if he was in trouble, he wouldn't call. I started changing the route. I put the bench first, then the pier, then the loop. If I had to see it, I wanted to see it before it had time to gather itself into the thing I feared. It didn't matter. At 2, wherever I was in the park, the whispering found me. It came up from the cup holders, out of the vent with the air, under the hood with the engine's heat. "Stay for supper." I pulled the fuse for the radio. The whispering used the bare wires anyway. I put cotton in my ears, and they sang through bone. I guessed lots of things. I guessed 4 people drowned at that spot once and wanted one more. I guessed a cook from the prison camp set out plates for men who never returned from a fire line and kept setting them when the men arrived in a way that suits a story. I guessed a family had pulled off the road near the pines in some year before I was born and had eaten fast food out of paper sacks, and something in the trees had learned to pretend to be a family because it wanted the ceremony of it. People call the piney woods haunted because the trees are close and the ground is wet and the air holds on to sound. I think it's haunted because people keep hoping near it, and hope has a way of sticking to places. It leaves a residue the way barbecue smoke does. The end of the season came. The park would thin out. The first cold snaps would make the snakes slow. I told myself I would leave. Then a paper appeared under my wiper blade like a parking ticket. It was the card from the chaplain again. On the back, not a date, but a list of 4 surnames. Lewis, R. Aguirre, Cohen, Price. Below those 4, a 5th with my last name. My last name is not uncommon, but it felt like the exact size of my mouth. I looked up and a man stood at the tree line outside the station. Not a figure. A man in a pressed shirt, sleeves rolled, collar unbuttoned, the sort of neatness no one keeps at 2 in the morning unless the neatness is the point. He lifted a hand. His palm was clean and smooth in the way of people who do not do work with their hands. He inclined his head toward the pines. He didn't open his mouth. He didn't need to. I heard him clear. "Stay for supper," he said. And this time there were no other voices. They didn't need to pile on. He had me. I went. There are moments when you say you had no choice. It isn't true. I had several. I could have woken the other ranger. I could have driven to the highway and turned south and not stopped until the billboards turned to trees without words. I could have put in my notice and sent a text to the woman whose number I saved, without asking if I could, and told her to take back the envelopes from my desk drawer. I went because there is a lure in finishing a bad thing. You want the ending even if you suspect it will use you. The bench was warm. The plates were set. The air smelled like burned bread. The wrong child voice was silent. The broken lung took a night off. The tired mother stood to one side in case I needed her, and the man in the pressed shirt sat across from me. The lake sighed at the shore with that tireless patience water has. The pines made their clean sound. The man put his hands flat on the table. I followed without wanting to and did the same. His hands were cold through the wood. The plates twitched. The numbers etched on the back swam into a shape. They were not inmate numbers. They were dates. 4 of them I recognized from cemetery records and news stories that park staff pass to each other when it's quiet. The 5th plate was new. The metal was still dull with warehouse dust. The date inscribed in it was tomorrow. I took my hands from the table. The man kept his there. He smiled like he'd won a small argument in a long marriage. He stood. The plates moved with him, not sliding but keeping their places by second intention. He walked toward the lake without turning, and I went with him, because that is what my legs did. We reached the soft part of the shore where your boots take on an inch of the place, and he stepped onto the thin ribbon of white roots that ropes the bank and then into the water like a man leaving a church. It was cold in a way the air was not. He went into his knees, his belt, his sternum. He did not float or sink. He stood until the water made a black cross on his shirt, and then he vanished. Not submerged, but gone like a light. The whispering hummed behind me at the table. The plates waited for the hands that would move them next. Mine. I walked back and did what you do when you attend to rituals. I squared the forks to the table's edge. I lifted each plate and placed it down where there was already a shallow ring worn into the wood, as if the table remembered every meal it never had. I arranged the napkins and felt the fabric like old shirts. I looked for food out of habit and found none. I set the spoon with the TDCJ stamp in the 4th place out of spite, and it did not match, and the not matching felt like a kind of correctness. The whispering soothed. It said stay for supper for the last time, and then it said thank you in 4 different ways. In the pines, something took a step and stopped. I drove my loop. I did not go home. I sat in the truck under the sodium light, by the dumpsters, and watched a feral cat circle the fence with the weary caution of a thing that has survived by not trusting anyone's generosity. When the sky lifted from black to gray, I took the plates in my arms one by one. They were heavier than they looked. I placed them in the cardboard box at the station and taped the top, and wrote metal parts on the side like the laziest lie. I slid the box onto a shelf where the maintenance guys kept PVC fittings and a coffee can full of unknown bolts. I wrote out a note to myself, do not sit. It looked like a joke a teenager leaves himself to feel brave. By noon, a couple checked into the site near the pines. They had a baby that didn't mind heat. They grilled fajitas, and the smell made the ranger station bearable for an hour. The man cut lines of lime with a plastic knife. The woman laid out paper plates patterned like watermelon slices. At 2 in the morning there was no table setting, and I thought I had done it. At 2:03 the whispers came up from the pines, not loud and not urgent, just present the way a fact is present. I drove there, and the table wore 4 settings again, plates I had never seen, spoons with no stamps. In the 4th place, my quarter store spoon lay turned just so, the stamp hidden. At the 5th place that wasn't there, a folded scrap of paper waited, and when I opened it I saw my name in the precise hand of a man who writes with effort. The date beneath it was tonight. The time was 2. I wish I could tell you I will quit. I wish I could say I don't drive that loop anymore. I wish I could say the voices fade if you act like you don't know they're there. People come to the park for a dozen reasons and leave with 2 or 3. The water calms them. The pine resin in the air clears something. The sight of the prison's distant glow reminds them that fences exist, and they are on the right side of them for now. I keep the spoon on my dashboard. I tell myself it is in case a child finds the table and needs a grown man to say no. I tell myself a lot of things. When the minute hand reaches straight up and the lake cools the air enough that your breath feels heavier, I go to the pines. I straighten what has been set. I do not sit. I do not eat. The voices ask me to stay and I tell them no in the same voice every time. It gets easier to say. It gets harder to mean. If you're reading this because you heard something about a table by the pines and thought it would make a good story or a good dare, do me a favor and keep walking. If you can't keep walking, if you find yourself there despite your good sense, if you feel the bench's warmth through your jeans and find the etched names meeting your fingers, use the only trick I've got. Bring a cheap spoon that doesn't match. Lay it down where the place setting looks too perfect. Break the pattern the table loves. Sit if you must, but put your hands in your pockets and keep them there no matter what voice uses a face you love. When the lake raises its breath and the pines lean toward you and the not child invites you like a friend who means you harm, think of this. The table doesn't want to feed you. It wants you to fill a seat. The worst part is how polite it is about it, how patient. It will wait through years and storms and budget cuts and drought. It will watch families come and go with their coolers and their paper plates. It will set itself at 2, whether anyone comes or not. It will make its little supper of your name and the date that suits you. Sometimes between the voices I hear another sound. It's not water and not wind and not the soft chitter of raccoons testing latches. It is like a fork lightly tapped against a glass at the start of a toast. It comes from under the table, where my feet will be if I ever forget myself. It says not yet in a voice that is mine. When I hear it, I drive the rest of the loop exactly at the speed limit. Hands at 10 and 2, every sign clean in my headlights. I do not look back. The pines hold their breath until I am gone. And then, they go on saying what they always say to anyone who has never been there at 2 a.m., which is that trees are only trees and a picnic table is only wood. If you believe that, you will be fine. If you don't, you will hear a simple invitation the way I do. You will hear it tonight. You will hear it tomorrow. No hurry. Stay for supper. The air around Cedar Hill State Park carried that sweet rot of pine needles mixed with damp earth. A smell that hung in the dark like a memory you didn't want to keep. Kids from the nearby towns treated it like their testing ground, sneaking in after hours to drink warm beer or dare each other to last the night in one of the pavilions. They'd talk big in the daylight, but by midnight the woods pressed close and the laughter always thinned. It wasn't just coyotes or the rustle of deer that drove them out. For years there had been stories about the pavilion near the lake, the one with beams running high under its roof. Teenagers swore that if you walked under it after midnight, you could see something pale hunched above, crawling along the wood like an insect. Some said it was hairless, slick-skinned, its limbs bending the wrong way, its eyes reflecting not like an animal's but like wet marbles catching starlight. Nobody ever stayed long enough to prove it. They ran, half screaming, half choking on their own disbelief. One September night, a group of 4 came from Duncanville, each eager to prove they weren't cowards. They parked their car on the shoulder off FM 1382 and hiked in, flashlights swinging wild arcs that made the trees look like they were breathing. Tyler carried a cooler of beer clinking with each step, while Kelsey held tight to her boyfriend Miguel's arm, already jumpy from the way the crickets cut off every so often like something heavy had stepped nearby. Derek walked last, silent. The kind of kid who pretended he didn't believe in ghost stories but never let his eyes stop moving. They found the pavilion easy enough, its roofline a black triangle against the sky. Picnic tables arranged in rows like pews waiting for a sermon. The place smelled faintly of smoke even though no one had used the grills for weeks. The cooler thudded onto a bench and cans cracked open, the sound too loud in the stillness. They joked and drank, tossing empty cans down the concrete floor. But every laugh sounded forced, echoing up into the rafters where shadows shifted in ways no one wanted to point out. It was Kelsey who finally whispered that she heard something, a skitter like claws dragging along wood. Miguel told her it was raccoons. Derek, already watching the beam, said no raccoon crawled upside down like that. When their flashlights lifted, the light caught something pale. At first it seemed like bare skin stretched over a thin frame. Too thin for a person, its shoulders sharp, its limbs longer than they should be. It clung to the crossbeams with hands that weren't quite hands. Fingers too many and too thin, bent backward against the grain of the wood. The faces of the kids went slack, all laughter sucked out at once. The thing turned its head, slow as if it had just remembered they were there. Its eyes reflected white like headlights glimpsed through fog, but they didn't blink. It didn't freeze or flee. It crawled lower, joints bending in wrong directions, its body sliding along the beam until its head hung down, watching them from above. The sound it made was not a growl or hiss. It was a rasping breath, wet and shallow, as though lungs were too small for the effort. Tyler dropped his beer, the can clattering so loud it felt like a gunshot. That sound broke the paralysis. Kelsey screamed, bolting for the tree line, Miguel right behind her. Derek didn't move. He stood locked in place as the thing unfolded from the beam and lowered itself, arms and legs working in jerky coordination. It landed with a muffled thump, crouched like a spider. Tyler grabbed Derek's sleeve, yanking him toward the dark. The four of them tore through brush, snagging clothes and cutting skin until the road came into view. The car doors slammed, tires screeched, and the pavilion was swallowed by distance. None of them spoke on the drive back except for Kelsey sobbing in the back seat and whispering over and over that it smiled at her. That she saw its mouth stretched too wide, teeth too many and too small. They didn't go to the police. Who would believe them? They told pieces of the story to friends, but everyone assumed it was beer and imagination. Over the weeks, though, each of them began to change. Tyler's parents found him sleepwalking, scratching his arms until they bled. Miguel quit football because he swore he could hear something crawling above him in the locker room ceiling. Kelsey wouldn't step under any roof beam, even in her own garage. Derek stopped showing up to school. When they went to his house, his mother said he stayed in his room, whispering at night, the ceiling fan blades creaking though the fan wasn't on. Then one morning he was gone. His window open, screen cut neatly. On the sill was a smear, pale as candle wax, as though something hairless had pressed against it before slipping away. Park rangers talk in low voices about the pavilion now. They say some nights you can hear kids' voices echoing under the roof, even when it's empty. Their laughter thin and nervous, cut off by a sound like nails dragging wood. They say the pale thing isn't just waiting anymore. It's looking, crawling from the beams down into the dark paths where the cicadas fall silent, hunting in the same rhythm as breath. And if you dare walk under that pavilion after midnight, you won't just see it. You'll feel its eyes fix on you, and once it has, no matter how far you run, it will follow. Because things that crawl where they shouldn't aren't bound to rafters or roofs. They're bound to you. And once you've looked too long, once it has looked back, the woods will never be empty again. Possum Kingdom State Park has a kind of silence that doesn't sit right on the skin. It's the silence of water lapping against rock in the dark, of coyotes carrying their voices too far, of cicadas that stop buzzing all at once when something heavier than a deer moves through the brush. The rangers who worked the summer months swore that one site in particular held more silence than the rest. It wasn't marked different on the maps, wasn't even tucked far into the woods. Just a patch of ground with a fire ring, a gravel pad, and a view of the lake. But every year, sometime in June or July, someone checked in for the night, and by morning they weren't there. The only thing left behind was a half-burned fire and a tent caked with wet black mud that wasn't there when they pitched it. The park office had a logbook with handwriting from different years. A college student in 1998, a family of 4 in 2006, an older fisherman in 2014. Different people, different ages, even different states listed on their driver's licenses. But every entry was the same in its ending. By sunrise, the site was empty. The car still parked by the wooden post, the gear left behind, but no one to claim it. Rangers filed reports, sheriffs sent out dogs, search parties combed the shoreline. But there was never a body, no footprints leading away from camp. No sign of panic, just absence, like the earth had swallowed them without a struggle. The newer rangers laughed it off, called it a story meant to spook campers into behaving. They didn't laugh for long. In the summer of 2019, a young couple from Wichita Falls set up on that very site. They were last seen grilling hot dogs on the fire ring, laughing while the smoke drifted into the trees. By morning, the grill lay cold. One hot dog half-eaten stuck to the grate. Their tent sagged under the weight of sludge that smelled of swamp water, though the lake was clear and rocky. Their car was still parked where they'd left it. Not a trace of them anywhere. Deputies dragged the lake for days and came up with nothing. That was when people started whispering. Locals remembered stories older than the park itself. Possum Kingdom Lake had been made by damming the Brazos River back in the 40s, drowning old homesteads, churches, and even a cemetery or two. Folks said the graves had been moved. But anyone who's lived near a man-made lake knows that's not the truth. Sometimes headstones get taken, but coffins stay put. And sometimes the water doesn't settle right on land that was never meant to drown. Some nights people swore they heard voices under the surface. Some swore they saw lantern lights flicker beneath the waves as if someone was still walking the dirt roads down there. The stories didn't keep campers away, though. Curiosity has a stronger pull than fear. Last July, a man named Travis came to camp alone. He wasn't local, just a middle-aged guy from Dallas who said he needed a break from work. The ranger who checked him in noticed he was quiet, polite, but not nervous. Travis picked that very site, the one they didn't recommend anymore but hadn't yet closed off. He said he wanted to be near the water, to fall asleep to the sound of it. The ranger wrote his license plate in the book and wished him a good stay. That was around 3 in the afternoon. By dusk, Travis had a fire going. Another camper a few sites down remembered seeing him toss a log on, the sparks rising into the night. They heard him humming too, something low and steady, almost a chant, though maybe that was the imagination filling in the gaps. After dark, the lake carried strange noises, but it wasn't unusual for the wind to whistle strange through the limestone cliffs. What wasn't normal was the scream that came around midnight. It wasn't a cry for help, not the way most people expect. It was cut short, strangled, like someone had been startled into silence. When the nearby campers got up the nerve to walk toward the site, the fire was blazing higher than it should have been, the flames bright and angry. But there was no one sitting by it. No humming anymore. Just the sound of water sloshing in the tent like something was moving inside. The campers didn't unzip it. They went straight to the rangers. By the time the rangers arrived, the fire had died down to ash, and the tent sagged under the weight of foul, dripping mud. No footprints, no clothes, no Travis. His car still waited at the post, locked, his wallet on the dash. The tent was dragged away and burned with gasoline in a pit behind the ranger station. None of the staff wanted to touch it longer than they had to. When the ashes cooled, they said the ground beneath was wet like fresh rain, though the sky had been clear all week. After that, the park made it unofficial policy to keep that site vacant, though it was never written on paper. They told people it was under maintenance or flooded. But the locals knew. They said if you walked by after midnight, you'd see the glow of a fire where no fire was lit. If you got closer, you'd hear a voice humming something tuneless, like a lullaby drowned underwater. And if you stayed too long, you might feel the mud tug at your boots, thick and cold even when the ground was dry. No one saw Travis again. The official report listed him as missing, presumed drowned. His family held a service in Dallas, though no body was buried. The last ranger to speak about it before transferring out swore that he went down one morning to check the site. The fire ring still smoked, though no one had camped there for weeks. He bent down, stirred the ashes with a stick, and found not char but clumped hair matted with mud. He dropped the stick and walked away, never filed it in the report. He told the story once, drunk, and then refused to talk about it again. Every summer, people still come to Possum Kingdom to fish, to hike, to camp by the water. They laugh at the legends, at the ghost stories whispered over beer cans and lantern light. But every so often, someone notices that site left empty. They ask why, and the ranger tells them it's too close to the water line. If they press, the ranger might say it floods too easy. But if they stay long enough, if they walk past when the lake is quiet and the cicadas pause, they might hear a hum threading through the trees, faint and patient, like someone still waiting for company at a fire that never goes out. And if they sit down long enough by that glow, they won't be seen come sunrise. Only a sagging tent slick with mud and a fire smoldering in silence. The night air at Caddo Lake feels different than anywhere else in Texas. It holds on to you. It smells like wet bark and old rope, like somebody opened a cedar chest that had been shut since before you were born. If you come off Highway 43 just past Uncertain and slide into the park after dusk, the light goes soft and green and the water shows you two skies, the one above you and the one spread out under the cypress knees like a mirror that forgot it was glass. Locals will tell you a lot of things in that part of East Texas. They'll tell you fish jump better on the backside of a thunderstorm, that owls call your name if you listen long enough, that there are lights down in the sloughs that don't belong to boats or houses. I used to smile and chalk it up to campfire talk. Then I took a job at the park, mostly cleaning up after weekend campers and dragging fallen limbs off trails after the wind came through. The longer I stayed, the more I understood there are places that never stopped being wild. Even when we hammered signs into them and stamped maps that told us where the danger ended and the fun began. It started one July when the lake steamed after sundown, and even the frogs sounded tired. The day had been 100 degrees with a heat index that made you think of ovens, but dusk brought a thin breeze that stirred the moss and bullfrogs and made the water pucker with tiny black gnats. I was putting away the kayaks near the rental shed when I saw a light between the trunks. Not big or bright, just the color of a match head when it first strikes. It hovered low, maybe 6 feet off the water, and it moved with intention. I thought it was a camper with a headlamp, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would be out in the rookery with a single weak light. There was a posted sign about staying off the water after dark unless you were on a guided paddle. People ignored signs all the time. I took a paddle and a vest and pushed a kayak into the water without thinking what I'd do if I actually found someone. The cypress knees looked like a crowd frozen mid-conversation, mouths open in surprise. The moss hung so thick it turned every breath into a sip. That little light slipped between trunks ahead of me and I followed, the kayak whispering with each stroke. When I clicked off my headlamp to get rid of my reflection, the world scaled down to silhouettes and ripples. The light ahead paused and pulsed twice like it knew I was there and wanted me closer. It wasn't a lantern. It wasn't a beam. It looked like a dim pearl of color suspended in the gloom, and with every pulse I felt a prickling run across my forearms and neck. The kind of warning you get when you stand too near a campfire and it licks your skin. The air wasn't hotter. If anything, it cooled, a thin needle of chill that pushed right through the humidity. But my skin reacted like it was being touched by something warm and insistent. I kept going because curiosity makes fools out of most of us. There's a place locals call the Cathedral, where the cypress arch in and bend together high above, where the air keeps sound for a beat before it lets go. I paddled under that arch and the light stopped dead center, hovering above an old stump cut flat so long ago it had become a table for lichens and spider webs. The water under me went still as if the lake held its breath. That's when I heard the whispering. It wasn't words at first. It was the sound of someone's mouth forming words inside your ear. The hair on my arms lifted. I could smell something that wasn't swamp. A clean, sharp scent like river stones after rain. For a second, just a second, the light flared bright enough to paint the bark and I saw the surface of the water boil with tiny points of red. Pinpricks no bigger than the head of a sewing needle. They popped in clusters that moved with the pulse of the light. Each pop was a kiss of heat on my hands where I gripped the paddle. I told myself it was bioluminescent algae. I told myself it was some scientific thing I'd read about and forgotten. I told myself a lot in those seconds. I stuck the paddle down to steady myself and felt mud give way under the tip, as if the lake floor had been waiting. That was when the whispering found my name. It said it in a voice I recognized too late. My grandfather used to take me catfishing when I was little, and he had a way of dragging out the last syllable of my name when he wanted me to pay attention. The whisper said my name like that, and I almost turned toward it with the relieved reflex of a child. Then it said, "Don't make them wait." The light pulsed hard enough to bloom orange inside my eyelids. The skin along my wrists burned like a stove coil just kissed me quick. I dug in, heaved the kayak around, and took 2 fast strokes back the way I came. The light followed. It didn't hurry. It paced me, pulsing a little brighter with every yard. The red pop stitched across the water on both sides of my hull, as if something below was breathing heat through a net. My forearms lit up with pain where sweat had collected, and I saw thin branching patterns scribing across my skin. Not exactly blisters, more like the outline of veins traced in irritated red. My heart jackhammered and I made the sound I make when I drop a wrench on my toe, half laugh, half curse. The one that tries to pretend the pain is nothing. The kayak scraped a submerged log and swung. I jabbed the paddle down for balance and it went deep into the mud with a kind of sucking welcome that turned my stomach. The whisper pressed in again. "We've been waiting. Bring them." When my bow bumped the dock, it felt like hitting a parking curb and waking up from a bad dream. The light stopped at the edge of the trees, hung a moment as if deciding, then thinned and sank until there was nothing left but the sickly reflection of the park light in the ripples. I dragged the kayak up with hands that shook like I'd taken too much cold medicine. On the walk back to the storage shed, I looked at my wrists and saw the red tracing already fading. By the time I turned off the shed's overhead light, it had ghosted away like a rash you only remember by how much it bothered you. I didn't tell anyone that night. East Texas has a way of making you keep your stranger stories to yourself. The next day, my coworker Janelle found a belt on the low boardwalk spur that leads back through the shallow part of the swamp. Leather, good quality, initials stamped into the end. She asked me to log it with the other lost and found junk. The initials were GR. I slid it into the plastic tote along with a dozen ball caps and one of those metal cups that keeps coffee hot for hours even when the lid is missing. When a boy went missing from Site 17 later that week, those initials tugged at me. Garrison Rice was 12, skinny, and lately obsessed with catching frogs. His mother said he liked to slip out when the air cooled, that he swore the frogs sang louder at night. Janelle called in the park police, and volunteers showed up with headlamps and reflective vests and the polite voice you use when you want people to feel useful. I walked the boardwalk twice, running my hands along the rail where algae gives it a velvet skin. When I came to the place where the cypress crowd tight and the water turns ink, I felt the whispering before I heard it. It pressed at me from the water the way a storm front does. I leaned out over the rail and waited without meaning to. All the birds had gone silent. Something green and heavy and patient looked back at me. We found Garrison the next morning sitting at the edge of the lake near the boat ramp with his feet in the water, staring like he was waiting for a movie to start. He was fine. No scratches, no sign he'd spent a night in a mosquito-feeding frenzy. He said he fell asleep on the boardwalk. He didn't look at his mother when he said it. He looked past her at the water as if anticipating applause. Later, after the family packed up and left, I walked back to the boardwalk and stared at the place where the boards crossed the black pocket under the arch of green. I told myself the boy had hidden and then felt bad about worrying people. I told myself a lot of things. Then I saw a cluster of tiny red pinpoints blink on the water like sparks from a match. They went out before they formed a pattern, like a mouth trying to make a word. In August, my cousin Taylor came to visit with his fiancée. He wanted the romantic version of Caddo, the one with mist and herons and photos that make you look like you went to a different state without leaving Texas. We went out at sunrise when the lily pads were still silver with dew, and the fishermen idled their motors with that gentleness that means they respect this water's moods. Taylor cracked jokes about gators, and I nodded in the way you do when you don't want to confirm or deny. On the way back, I pointed out the cathedral and told them how the trees looked like they were holding hands. Taylor wanted to come back at night, said he wanted to see the famous lights. I told him there weren't any famous lights here, that he was thinking of Marfa. He grinned and said every place has lights if you stay long enough and drink enough. His fiancée smiled too, the thoughtful kind that doesn't reach the eyes. We came back after 9. I told them we weren't getting in boats. I told them we'd stand on the boardwalk and they'd see plenty of nothing, and that would be that. The night was damp enough to drink. The moss hung in still sheets and every sound came through syrup. We stood with our hands on the rail and stared. At first, the only light was the weak shine of the parking lot and the pale smear of stars over the black trees. Then something low near the water winked. Taylor made the sound people make when they get what they asked for. The light pulsed a slow, steady rhythm and moved left, then right. It gathered brightness like someone turned up a dimmer. My skin tightened the way it had in July. The red points stirred below, small and tentative like fish testing the surface. Taylor said that's not a headlamp, and I said nothing. His fiancée took a step forward and put her palm on the rail. The light pulsed harder, and the water under us answered. Red points flaring and popping against the slick wood pilings with a sound like soda fizzing in your ear. She jerked her hand back with a small cry. I saw the same branching welt climb her wrist, quick and thin and angry. We left because she wanted to and because I didn't. If I had told them what I'd seen in the cathedral, they would have laughed. And if they hadn't laughed, something worse would have happened inside the space where jokes normally go. In the truck, with the air conditioner blasting air that smelled like dust and cold plastic, Taylor asked me why this place had me spooked. I said nothing twice. Back home, I tried to sleep and dreamed about my grandfather's voice coming from underwater where the roots knit together. He said my name and then said bring them again, and I woke with my teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached like I'd spent the night chewing a stone. In September, a dry wind pushed through from the west and the lake dropped a little. The waterline exposed old stumps and somebody's discarded crab net. The nights cooled. The tourists thinned. An older couple from Dallas showed up on a Thursday with a little teardrop camper and the kinds of walking sticks you buy from a catalog that also sells luggage with secret pockets. I gave them a map and pointed out the best sunrise spots. The man grinned in that fixed way some men grin when they don't want advice. He asked whether the lights really show up on clear nights. I asked which lights. He said the ones that don't need batteries. His wife laughed like she was being polite for both of them. I told him I didn't know about lights, that people see all kinds of things in the woods. He tapped the counter twice with his knuckle, a little drum beat, and said, "That's what we're here for." At 2 in the morning, I woke with the sense that there was a door open somewhere. It wasn't a sound. It was a cold awareness, like when a front comes in and you can feel the barometer slip in your ears. I sat up in my little park housing room and listened to frogs, to a distant truck on the highway, to the soft waver of wind in the leaves. Then I heard a voice saying hello. It sounded like it was coming in through the screen. I got up, went to the window, and saw nothing but the dark press of trees. The voice said hello again, and this time my own name followed. It was the wife's voice from the couple, too bright for 2 in the morning, as if she was trying to be friendly to a neighbor she'd surprised taking out the trash. I pulled on boots, grabbed a flashlight, and walked the gravel toward the camp loop. Their camper door was open. The man sat on the step in his socks. He looked at me and his eyes slid out of focus and back as if he were adjusting to the idea that I existed. He said his wife went out to see the glow. He said she heard a humming. He said it sounded like jars clicking together in the dark. He stood and put a hand on my shoulder like we were about to pray. We walked without speaking toward the boardwalk. My light threw a cone that ate itself at the edges. The woods ahead looked full and flat at the same time, like a backdrop some careless stagehand had hung too close. Halfway down the boardwalk, the air changed. The temperature shifted in that sudden way that makes you think of opening a freezer. The hair on my arms lifted and the skin along my wrists sizzled. The light was waiting where the railing makes a jog to the left, low and almost shy. It pulsed once, then again. Red points walked across the water toward us, hundreds of them, a marching galaxy that burst wet and soft against the pilings and the boardwalk floorboards. The man took a step forward as if he'd been called to the front of a church. I reached for him and caught his sleeve. The voice said his name in his wife's voice, and then said it again in a different voice. One so close to my grandfather's that my hand let go without permission. The man smiled at nothing I could see and took off his socks. He set them neatly by the rail. He stepped down into the black water like it was bath temperature and waded out until he was waist deep. The light moved with him, staying at eye level. I shouted for him to come back. The word back made the whisper surge until it became a wavering chorus. The red points clustered around his thighs. He flinched like he'd brushed a nettle. He kept going with the slow stubbornness of a sleepwalker. There is a step down from the shelf where the cattails grow into a deeper channel. He found it. His chin dipped. His mouth opened. He went under with the quietest sound I've ever heard a person make. The light paused where his face had been, pulsing, then sank straight down until it wasn't there anymore. The red points flared so bright I could see them through my closed lids, a map of nerves under the skin of the lake. Then they went out. We dragged the water with hooks at dawn. Park police, game wardens, volunteers in long pants and bright shirts that said they'd done this before. The wife cried without sound, her face going mean around the eyes like grief had gripped it and squeezed. After 3 hours, we found him in a back eddy snagged in roots, lungs full of nothing but lake. The coroner said drowning. The report said probable misadventure. The park manager told me not to say lights if anyone asked. He told me to say fatigue, disorientation, darkness. He told me to say the word tragic in a voice that makes people nod and go home a little quieter than they arrived. The marks on my wrists kept coming back after that. They showed up when the air went wet and the frogs went silent. Thin, branching red beneath the skin that stung when I washed my hands. I tried different soaps. I tried not to look. I tried to ignore the way I could feel the lake from my bed. How it sat in the dark like a body with a fever slipped under a blanket waiting for somebody to lay a cool hand on its forehead. In October, a cold front blew the humidity flat and the lights didn't show for a while. Campers came and went, taking pictures of leaves they swore were red, even though everything here is green with the stubbornness of old money. Chanel made jokes about pumpkin spice bait for base. We got 3 calls about a raccoon that had learned to open coolers with bungee cords. I let myself believe it had been a long, hot summer playing ventriloquist with my nerves. Then the boy with the initials on the belt came back with his family. School break. His mother came to the desk and asked me if we planned to have more security on the boardwalk at night. I said the boardwalk closed at dusk. She smiled the way you do when a rule and a child share a room. She asked me to keep an eye out. She said Garrison woke at 2 every night and stood at the camper window. She said he didn't blink. The boy walked in behind her and laid his hand on the counter. The red tracer he showed on his wrist so fine you'd think an artist did it with a pen. He looked at me with an adult's patience. He asked if we had night paddles. I said not for kids. He said he wasn't a kid. I didn't sleep that night. At 1:50 I put on boots and walked toward the boardwalk, because you can either stay in bed and let your head make the pictures, or you can go where the pictures are and admit they're real. The lake was a flat black coin with damp breath rising from its edge. The light came up before I reached the bend. It wasn't shy. It pulsed a steady cadence that reached under my ribs with the ease of a familiar tune. The water answered with a sheet of red flickers that advanced and retreated like a tide of sparks. When the whisper came this time, it was not one voice or even a chorus. It was a mouth too large to fit in one ear. It said my name and then didn't stop. It pushed out the names of people I'd lost. The living too. The way a clever caller flips through a small town's phone book. It settled on my grandfather when it felt me pause inside. It told me he was waiting under the trees. It told me the water kept heat inside it like a hand keeps a coin warm. It told me bring them and the burning stops. I turned and saw a figure at the far end of the boardwalk, a small one in a hoodie. Garrison stood with his arms down like a doll pulled out of a drawer. He wasn't alone. Behind him, the woman from Dallas watched with a gaze so detached, she might as well have been looking at a painting she didn't care for. Her hair hung straight and wet, though it hadn't rained. Waterline scum striped her blouse. She lifted her hand and the red pattern showed on her wrist like a brand. When she opened her mouth, the smell that came out was not breath but riverstone. She said, "You are late." The boy stepped forward and the whisper surged until the wood under my boots hummed. I felt the urge to step sideways, to block him without touching him, to do something a person in charge is supposed to do. Then the skin on my wrists lit up like the instant before a blister rises, and a different urge climbed my back and slid into my shoulders with the ease of a coat. It said, "Let him pass." It said, "You've been doing this since July." It said, "Give us what we asked for." I might have let him go. I might have stood aside and watched him walk down into the water to meet a light that wanted him. I might have done what the whisper told me I'd been doing in small ways, with jokes that made the light sound like a legend you should test, with directions that pointed tourists toward places where the trees lean in. I might have. What saved me was a sound I knew like my own breath. It was the click and whine of a trolling motor, far off and disciplined. The way old men who fish for crappie idle their boats without ever scaring what they're hunting. It came from the channel to the right where the water opens. The whisper stuttered long enough for my thought to slip free, like a tooth freed from a belt in a machine. I grabbed the boy's shoulder and said his name out loud. I didn't mean to. It came from a place in me that remembers being small and being called back from a curb when a truck was coming. He flinched like I'd slapped him. The woman behind him opened her mouth wider and 30 feet of boardwalk air went cold as a glass pulled from a freezer. The red burning on my wrists went from 1,000 needles to a single slow insistence like a hand closing. The boat light turned the trunks white and then slid past. An old man tipped his cap without meaning to, the way you do when you see human shapes anywhere near water at night. The whisper lost its shape. The boy sagged. The woman's mouth worked and could not make a word without the water's assistance. She thinned, or the fog took her, or the night finally remembered she wasn't standing there. I pulled Garrison back from the bend and kept pulling until the boardwalk delivered us to gravel. We ran without running until we hit the camper loop. He cried then, real and ugly, and his mother opened the door and my name came at me like a thrown rope. The next day, the park manager asked me to write a report. He told me to keep it simple. He wrote the word safety 3 times in one paragraph, and it looked like an incantation that could make the world behave. I wrote what he wanted and kept the rest. I haven't walked the boardwalk at night since. I haven't taken a kayak under the cathedral since the day the water boiled with red. But every evening when the wind goes slack and the moss hangs without rustle, I feel a pressure start in the center of my chest that eases only if I sit on the porch and look toward the water. I don't see the light every time. I hear the frogs, the motors, and Owl working his circuit. I keep my hands in my pockets so I don't rub the places that burn. On the worst nights, I open the lost and found, tote and take out the belt with the initials, and run my thumb over the letters as if remembering them correctly could keep the owner from being called. Again, people come and people go. They ask about the best place for sunrise. They ask if they can swim. They ask if they can bring glass containers, which they cannot. Some of them ask if there are really lights on the water. I say sometimes people see things when the air is right and the night is still. I don't tell them what the light says. I don't tell them that when it's quiet and I am almost asleep, I hear my grandfather in the trees asking why I haven't brought anyone lately. His voice empty of accusation because the lake doesn't need anger to get what it wants. I don't tell them I've started hearing other voices too, slipped in with the frog song and the squeak of oarlocks, patient voices that are learning the names of the ones who plan their trips months in advance and circle the boardwalk on their maps with neat little pens. I don't tell them that the burning stops when I answer out loud. I sit with my fists closed in my pockets and I lie like a park employee ought to. Then the night takes one more breath and the water brightens, and far back where the knees cluster together, the light wakes without waking the air. Pulsing with a rhythm so familiar I sometimes match my breathing to it, and if a truck eases off Highway 43 and turns into the park at just that moment, I tell myself it's coming for the stars. I tell myself a lot of things. The lake tells me to save my breath. It says I'm not required to bring anyone. It says they come on their own. It says I can sit and watch and let the burning do its work until it stops bothering me entirely. It says this in a voice that sounds like me, patient and proud, and when I finally understand that, I sleep fine with my window open to the heavy dark where the trees lean in like they're listening for my step. The summer nights at Lake Livingston always carried a heaviness, the kind of damp heat that clung to the skin and whispered of things lurking beyond the tree line. Locals had long warned about the lake's currents, how they pulled and twisted in ways that didn't belong to calm waters, but most shrugged it off as superstition. Still, there was one story everyone knew, though no one said it too loud once the sun dipped under the pines. They said a boy drowned here decades ago, a child who had wandered too far from shore, and though his body was pulled up long ago, his presence never left. Swimmers late at night sometimes felt his hand, small and cold, curling around their ankles. Some swore he was trying to drag them down with him. Others whispered he was just desperate for someone to pull him back up. It was a July evening when Aaron, a college kid from Huntsville, parked his old Ford by the water. He had a cooler of cheap beer and a restless energy, the kind that made the empty stretches of highway and the shadowy lakeside seem like an adventure instead of a warning. His girlfriend, Michelle, sat in the passenger seat scrolling through her phone, uninterested in the dark lake but unwilling to be left behind. They'd met up with two other friends, Derek and Lena, who were already barefoot at the water's edge, daring each other to swim out where the moonlight barely touched. The night was alive with cicadas and the occasional splash of a fish, but under it all there was a strange quietness, the kind that settled too heavy on the ears. Aaron stripped off his shirt and waded in first, the water warm at the surface but strangely cold at his knees. He laughed, called back to Michelle to stop being a coward, then dove under. The water closed around him, muffling the world above, and for a moment it was just his heartbeat and the burn of holding breath. When he surfaced, Derek was already paddling toward the deeper water, shouting for him to keep up. Lena lingered closer to shore, glancing nervously back at Michelle, who hugged herself with unease. They swam farther than they should have. The lake was a mirror for the stars, stretching out in endless black. Aaron kicked lazily on his back, eyes half closed when he felt it. A brush against his ankle. Not a fish, not weeds, but fingers. Small, curling fingers that clutched and squeezed. His laugh died in his throat as he jolted upright, splashing hard. Derek swam over, annoyed, asking what the hell he was doing. Aaron shook his head, forcing a grin, telling him it was nothing, just weeds. But he knew it wasn't weeds. The pressure had been deliberate, purposeful. A hand. They swam back, but Aaron's thoughts stayed tangled in that touch. Later, while Michelle sulked in the truck and Derek and Lena whispered at the shoreline, he went back in alone. The lake seemed quieter now, The cicadas hushed, the water still as glass. He waded waist deep, heart hammering with equal parts fear and fascination. He told himself it was the beer or maybe just nerves. But then something tugged again. Not a brush this time, but a sharp yank that nearly knocked him off balance. He gasped, thrashing. And in that split second his eyes caught movement below. Pale, small. A boy's face just beneath the surface. Wide eyes staring upward, mouth open as if frozen mid-cry. Then it was gone, swallowed by black water. Aaron stumbled back onto shore, shivering despite the heat. He didn't tell Michelle what he saw, only muttered excuses claiming he was tired. But that night, back in his apartment, when he closed his eyes, he felt it again. The grip, the pleading hold. And he dreamt of the boy, waterlogged skin clinging to bone, eyes milky and lips blue, reaching out with desperate hands. The following weekend he returned. Alone this time. Something pulled at him, stronger than reason. He parked at the same spot, the lake stretching silent under a heavy sky. The water welcomed him like a grave, closing over his shoulders as he swam toward the darker depths. His breath grew short, and for a moment he thought he'd turn back. But then it happened again. The hand clutching, holding. This time he didn't fight. He let it pull him down, the surface shrinking above, stars smearing into a wavering blur. He opened his eyes underwater, expecting murk, but what he saw froze his heart. Children. Dozens of them. Pale faces drifting in the dark, mouths moving soundlessly, eyes fixed on him. Their hands reached, some gentle, some clawing, and at the center of them was the boy he'd seen before. Small, thin, hair floating like weeds, eyes begging. Aaron's chest burned, but he couldn't look away. The boy held his ankle again, staring at him with that expression that was neither threatening nor kind, just endless and hollow, as if he was asking a question Aaron didn't know how to answer. Then the darkness folded over him. The next morning, a fisherman found Aaron's truck abandoned by the shore. His clothes and cooler still sat inside, the beer cans half empty. They dragged the lake for days but found nothing. Locals shook their heads and muttered that the boy had claimed another. By August, the story grew into whispers around campfires, warnings to kids who dared swim after midnight. They said if you felt that grip under the surface, you had to choose. Pull him up or let him pull you down. But no one ever figured out what pulling him up meant, because no one who tried ever made it back. And Lake Livingston stayed dark, its surface calm, while beneath it countless small hands waited for the next swimmer to wander too far into the night. The park road that winds through Pedernales Falls looks quiet enough in the day. A stretch of blacktop cutting through cedar and oak, the air buzzing with cicadas. But after dark, the place takes on a different weight. The trees pressing in, the shadows moving wrong. Drivers who've come back late from fishing or camping talk about how the headlights sometimes catch deer on the shoulder. It's Texas hill country, so that's nothing unusual. What's unusual is when the deer lift their heads and there's nothing in the sockets where the eyes should be. Just pale holes that shine faintly white, like bone under a flashlight beam. A few people swear the deer don't even blink. They just turn their heads too far, like their necks are on hinges, watching as the car passes, or worse, stepping right into the lane like they want to be hit. I first heard about it from my cousin, who worked evenings at a feed store in Johnson City. He said he nearly wrecked his old Chevy after swerving to miss one. The thing was standing dead center in the road, and when the headlights hit it, he thought its face was smeared with mud. But then he saw the empty sockets, and he said the hollows glowed just enough to make him sick. He swerved, ended up halfway in a ditch, and when he looked back in the rear view, the thing was still standing in the road, head cocked to one side, staring with holes. He told me his truck stank of rot for a week after, even though nothing had touched it. I laughed when he said it, but he didn't. His hands shook when he smoked after telling me. I didn't believe him until I saw one myself. It was late summer, hot even at midnight, and I was driving back from Austin after dropping off a girl I'd been seeing. The park road was empty, no moon, the kind of night when the dark eats your headlights and you feel like you're driving underwater. I came around a bend and my brights picked up movement. A deer, lean and long-legged, stepped onto the shoulder. At first it looked normal. Then it turned its head toward me and I saw the empty sockets, two hollow pits, pale inside, like the skull had pushed forward through the skin. They weren't black holes. They glowed faint white, faint enough that I thought my eyes were playing tricks. My hands tightened on the wheel and I slowed. The thing didn't move away. It just stood there, Its body looked wrong too. The legs were too thin, the ribs showing sharp, and the hide seemed stretched like it was too tight on the bones. As I passed, it swung its head with me, following without moving its feet. My skin prickled and I couldn't breathe right. The truck's cab felt smaller, hot. When I looked in the mirror, I thought for a second there were 3 of them standing in the road where there had only been 1. I didn't look again. After that night, I started asking around. Most folks laughed it off, said it was just deer with infections or headlights catching them strange, but some didn't laugh. One older man who worked as a ranger at Pedernales Falls told me he'd seen tracks leading from the road into the brush, but the prints weren't right. They started as deer hooves and ended as something closer to bare human feet, small and pressed deep like whoever left them had been running heavy. He told me quiet, like he didn't want to be heard, that sometimes campers vanished around the river, and when they found the campsites later, food was gone but clothes were left. Like someone wanted to dress but didn't know how, he said. His eyes stayed on mine long enough that I didn't doubt him. The story stretched back farther. In the 70s, a local paper wrote about a crash where a family swerved to miss deer and rolled their station wagon. The father died, and the daughter said she'd seen a deer with no eyes. The paper treated it like the ramblings of a traumatized kid, but her words were printed. She'd said the deer came right up to her window before they lost control. She remembered its head bent low, sockets close to the glass, white glowing emptiness looking in. I found that clipping at the library, and the photo of the wreck still had bloodstains on the seats. The part that stayed with me, though, came from a woman I met at a gas station near Blanco. She told me she'd been driving home from Fredericksburg one night when a herd ran across the road. She slowed, expecting them to clear, but then noticed all their heads were turned toward her and none had eyes. Dozens of them. She said their sockets pulsed faint like fireflies, glowing in rhythm. They didn't cross like normal deer either. They moved in jerks, legs stiff like puppets pulled by strings. She sat frozen in the car, too scared to honk or move. When she finally closed her eyes and slammed the gas, her bumper clipped one. But when she stopped to check, there was no dent, no hair, no blood. Nothing but a smell in the air, coppery and sour, that clung to her clothes for days. I don't drive that road much anymore, not at night. Folks who do say the deer are getting bolder. Some say they follow cars now, running alongside in the ditches. Others say they stand on 2 legs at the tree line, watching, waiting. A man at the bar told me his brother swore one came right up to his window when he stopped at the overlook. He said it leaned its head in like it wanted to climb through. And when it opened its mouth, there weren't any teeth. Just a long, wet tongue that split down the middle like a snake's. His brother drove off without shutting the door, never went back for the truck. Sometimes I wonder what they are. Maybe not deer at all. Maybe something wearing deer-like clothes, stretching the skins thin, pressing bone through. Maybe the sockets glow because something's inside looking out, trying to see through the wrong kind of body. The park still advertises its trails and waterfalls. Families still camp and swim there. But I think about those missing campers, about the clothes left behind. And I think about what the ranger said, about the tracks that end in bare feet. I think about how the smell of rot lingered in my cousin's truck, and how I've caught it myself sometimes, faint on my clothes after I drive past the falls at night. It's a smell that's hard to describe until you've breathed it in. Not just rot, not just animal. It's the smell of something old and wet and human, like graves opened too early. When you catch it in the middle of that road, with no one around and nothing but cedar and stone in every direction, you'll know you're not alone. And if you see the pale sockets glowing at the edge of the headlights, you'll remember what I've said. Don't stop. Don't swerve. Just keep driving. Because if you look too long into those hollows, something might decide it's time for you to join the herd. The last of the summer heat clung to Garner State Park like a fever. By late August, the days were still punishing, but the nights cooled enough for families to crowd the campsites along the Frio River. The park's rangers had grown used to the rhythms of campers, fires burning down to embers, the faint smell of charred marshmallows, children laughing too late into the night. It was routine, predictable, which was why the site at Campsite 23 stood out like a wound. It was just past dawn when Ranger Douglas spotted the smoke. Not the heavy black of a fire out of control, but the steady curl of a campfire still burning long after it should have been doused. He walked down the gravel path, boots crunching in rhythm with the cicadas, and called out as he approached. Campsite 23 looked lived in. A family tent stood zipped halfway open, the flap hanging slack. 2 sleeping bags lay inside, unzipped as though their occupants had simply climbed out during the night. A 3rd bag was spread near the edge of the tent, also unzipped. By the picnic table, plates were set with food. Pancakes gone stiff, scrambled eggs beginning to crust, juice glasses half full. A radio played softly on the table, static washing in and out as if someone had just stepped away. Douglas circled, calling again. No one answered. The fire still burned low, fed by a log that hadn't yet collapsed into ash. He poked it with a stick and felt a ripple of unease crawl up his back. Fires like this weren't left unattended, not by families, not with kids. He walked down toward the river, the Frio running low and glassy in the morning light. No splashing, no laughter, no movement on the water, just stillness. By noon, the other rangers had joined him. They searched the trails, checked the parking lot, even called into the visitor center to see if anyone had checked out early. The family's truck was still parked near the site, doors locked, keys dangling from a lanyard inside the tent. Wallets, purses, and a camera rested on the picnic table as if someone had just gone to stretch their legs. But there were no tracks leading away. The ground, sandy and dry, should have preserved footprints. Instead, the dirt held only the marks of arrival, the tire treads, the shuffle of shoes setting up camp, and then nothing else. It was as though they had ceased to exist once the fire was lit. By the 2nd day, the place began to feel wrong. Rangers rotated shifts to keep the fire burning for evidence, though it unnerved them. Meals set out on plates never touched, swarms of flies circling but never landing. One ranger swore the scrambled eggs looked as fresh as the day they'd been cooked. No mold, no rot, as if time had stopped at the table. Another claimed she heard voices when she leaned too close to the tent, the faint rise and fall of a family murmuring in conversation. But when she pulled back the flap, silence, just empty bags, rumpled but cold. When the search expanded, volunteers combed the hills and riverbanks. Helicopters scanned from above. Dogs brought in from Uvalde sniffed the grounds and whined at the edge of the campsite but refused to step inside. The family's names were broadcast on the radio. Neighbors back home said they were ordinary folks, churchgoers, the kind who barbecued in the backyard and waved at strangers. Nothing in their lives hinted at running off or vanishing into the hills. And yet they were gone, leaving everything behind but themselves. Weeks passed. The campsite was cordoned off, but the fire never seemed to die. Rangers doused it with water, buried it under sand, even removed the fire ring entirely. Each morning they'd return to find flames licking at fresh wood as though unseen hands had stoked it. The food remained on the table, unspoiled. A plate of pancakes, glass of juice, a stack of scrambled eggs steaming faintly in the cool air. It became something no one wanted to approach. Rangers walked wide circles around the site, muttering that it belonged to someone, or something else now. Then came the reports from campers in nearby sites. Children woke crying in the night, saying a man stood outside the tent asking where his family had gone. A woman said she saw figures sitting at the picnic table when she passed by on her way to the restroom. A man and 2 children, their faces turned away. When she blinked, they were gone, leaving only the firelight. A couple from San Antonio reported hearing laughter near the Frio at midnight, though no one was allowed near that end of the park anymore. Douglas himself stayed longest, feeling the weight of the thing grow heavier with each week. He stopped sleeping well, waking from dreams of sitting at the picnic table, of reaching for a fork and finding his own plate waiting, the food steaming, the family's voices soft around him. In the dreams, he could never see their faces, only their hands passing plates, pouring juice, unzipping sleeping bags as if preparing to crawl inside forever. When fall arrived, Garner State Park emptied out. The air cooled, the river dropped further, and most of the campsites were left vacant. But Site 23 still burned, the fire stubborn and alive. The food waiting, the bags unzipped, no trace of a family walking away. Only the impression they'd been called somewhere deeper into the woods, pulled by voices no one else could hear. Douglas left the Rangers not long after. He couldn't shake the sound of the static radio that played each time he approached, carrying faint threads of music mixed with laughter. Sometimes when he drove past the park at night, he swore he saw the glow of fire through the trees, brighter than any lantern, like a beacon calling families off the road. He never went back, but others did. More than one hiker stumbled into Site 23 and claimed they smelled pancakes fresh off the pan, or heard the crackle of a fire that hadn't been touched in years. The records show the family was never found. Not in the park, not beyond it. The truck was eventually towed, the wallets bagged and logged, but the campsite itself was left alone. Even now, visitors whisper about it, warning each other not to wander too close to the empty site. The fire is still burning, they say. The food is still waiting, and if you linger too long, you might hear someone ask you to sit down just for a moment, just until supper is ready. And if you do, you may never leave the table again. The wind on the caprock always seemed to hold voices if you listened long enough. It swept across the grasslands in long, sighing waves, rattling dry mesquite branches and carrying the smell of dust and earth. Locals said it wasn't just the wind. They told stories about the scream that rose from the prairie at night, a sound so sharp it cut through the wide emptiness like glass shattering. It came sudden, without warning, echoing across the red cliffs and canyons, and if anyone was foolish enough to chase it, they were never seen again until dawn, when rangers or hikers would find their shoes neatly lined up at the trailhead, as if they'd left for church barefoot. The land gave no explanation. The prairie swallowed everything. Marcus lived 2 towns over in Kutake, where the gas station cashier knew your grandfather's name and the high school gym doubled as a storm shelter. He grew up with the scream as a sort of background myth, like the rattlesnakes in the tall grass or the stories of Comanche ghosts that drifted over campfires. His father used to tell him, don't go looking for things that call out in the night. Whatever needs you enough to scream isn't looking for help, it's looking for company. Still, when you're 23, with a truck that barely holds together and a group of friends with more beer than sense, warnings feel like a dare. That was how Marcus ended up out at Caprock Canyons late one Friday. Headlights bouncing over the gravel road, dust curling up into the black Texas sky. There were 4 of them that night. Marcus drove with Jared riding shotgun, always the loudest and most eager. In the back sat Becca and Thomas, a couple that never seemed to tire of picking at each other's nerves. They parked near the trailhead where the state put up signs about bison crossings, the kind of quiet rules people laughed at until they met one of the shaggy beasts up close. The night stretched out around them, endless with only the sharp chorus of crickets and the faint rustle of prairie grass. They killed the engine, stepped into the silence, and waited. At first there was nothing. The air smelled dry, metallic, as if the rocks themselves were exhaling. Then, just when Jared started muttering about ghost stories and Becca lit her cigarette, the scream came. It ripped across the night like something tearing loose from the earth. It was high and desperate, but not quite human. A sound that seemed to pull from every direction at once. It rose and cut off in an instant, leaving the crickets stunned into silence. The 4 of them froze, the hair prickling on Marcus's arms. Jared grinned in the dark and said, "Well, we found it. Let's go." The scream came again, further into the grasslands this time, as though moving, beckoning. Thomas muttered that it was probably coyotes, but his voice shook in a way that made Becca smirk nervously. Marcus didn't want to follow, but Jared already had a flashlight swinging through the dark, bouncing off clumps of grass and the jagged shadows of mesquite. The others trailed behind him, their boots crunching gravel, the prairie opening up wide around them. The scream drew them further from the safety of the trailhead, each time vanishing just as they thought they were close. The land played tricks. The moonlight cast shifting patterns over the grass. Their footsteps echoed strangely, as if doubled. Once Marcus swore he heard another set of feet, bare and quick, darting just outside the circle of their flashlights. Becca whispered that someone was out there with them, maybe another hiker, but her voice was thin. They called out, Jared with mock bravery, Thomas with irritation, but nothing answered except the scream farther off, pulling them like a rope through the dark. They walked until the trail was gone beneath them, the flat earth giving way to the canyon rim. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that doesn't belong to late summer. Below, shadows pooled like water, endless and shifting. The scream rose again, closer now, and Marcus thought for a moment it came from under his own feet, as though the prairie itself was crying. The sound twisted something inside him, made him want to take his shoes off, to leave them neatly behind and step barefoot into the open. He caught himself shaking, and saw Jared already unlacing his boots with a blank expression like he was sleepwalking. Thomas cursed and grabbed him, but Becca had gone quiet, staring into the dark with wide eyes. Marcus realized she was barefoot already, her shoes neatly together at the edge of the canyon rim. The scream split the air once more, and this time it didn't end. It rose, piercing, stretching longer than any lungs could hold. Jared and Becca stepped forward, faces slack as though walking into church bells. Thomas tried to pull Becca back, but her skin felt like ice under his grip, and when he let go, she slipped from his hand as though she weighed nothing. Marcus yelled, his voice torn away by the sound, and stumbled backward, tripping on his own laces. He hit the dirt hard, the flashlight skittering away. For one breathless second he saw them. Figures in the grass, thin, pale, barefoot, dozens of them, eyes like holes in the moonlight. Their mouths opened in perfect unison with the scream. When he blinked, Jared and Becca were gone. The grass swayed in the breeze. The night closed back around him. Thomas was on his knees, sobbing, shoes still on, clutching at the dirt. Together they stumbled back toward the trailhead, the land spinning around them, every shadow whispering. They didn't speak, only ran, until the faint shape of the truck rose in the distance like salvation. At dawn, a ranger found Marcus slumped against the hood, shaking, unable to explain where the others had gone. Thomas had vanished too, barefoot, his shoes neatly lined beside the trail marker, laces tucked. They searched for days, combed the canyons, sent dogs into the grasslands, but no one came back. Only the scream remained, rising each night, carrying further, as if looking for more. Now Marcus doesn't go near the caprock after dark. He says the land remembers who's walked it. Sometimes he wakes in the night, barefoot in the hallway of his own house, his shoes lined up neatly by the door, and outside on the wind, the prairie screams for him again. The Gulf waters around Mustang Island were black as tar when the fog first rolled in. A strange curtain that seemed to rise from the surface rather than drift down from the sky. I was standing shoulder to shoulder with two old fishermen who knew these beaches better than anyone. But the moment the haze thickened, even they went quiet. There wasn't a breeze stirring, no shift of current, just this wall of damp, sulfur-stinking mist that pressed against our faces like wet cloth. I could taste it on my tongue, bitter and metallic like rotten eggs left in a hot truck bed. At first we thought it was some natural thing, maybe a red tide bloom or something kicked up from oil rigs offshore, but then the voices began. They were faint at first, carried as if through cupped hands. Each of us froze because the sounds weren't random echoes, not the ocean or birds or the snap of seaweed against rocks. They were words, dragging across the fog like whispers funneled through hollow tubes. One of the old men cursed and dropped his rod in the sand because the voice had said his name clear as anything, stretching it out long and mournful the way a mother might call her boy home at dusk. I stood rigid, every nerve jumping, because a moment later I heard my own name in that same dragging tone. My mother had been dead for 20 years, but the way the syllables rose and fell, it was her voice, without a doubt. The men broke first. Their hands trembled so hard the reels clattered as they abandoned them, rods left half buried in sand. They ran stiff-legged up the beach toward the blinking glow of the bait shop, boots pounding the planks of the pier until they faded. I stayed a few seconds longer, listening, telling myself it was just the wind playing tricks. But the fog shifted, curling against me, and I realized I couldn't see the water anymore. It was like standing in a field of ash. Then something brushed past my calf, gentle like the fingers of a child, and I bolted. Later that night, when I found the old men again, they swore they'd seen shapes moving in that fog. Not human exactly. More like silhouettes bent too far forward with arms dragging too low. They said the figures walked toward the sound of their own names and then melted into the mist. A week passed and word spread through the island town. More fishermen had stories. Some claimed they'd returned in daylight to find their rods laid neatly in rows, handles pointing the same direction, like someone had gathered them with quiet care. Others said they heard entire conversations spoken in voices they knew. Wives, brothers, sons. Every word coaxing them to step further down the surf until their boots filled with black water. By August, the fog was expected. Folks along Mustang said it came without warning, sometimes at midnight, sometimes just after dawn, always without wind, always with that sulfur stink. There were reports of missing men, fishermen whose gear was found but whose bodies never washed back. People started saying the fog wasn't weather at all, that it was something alive. One ranger said he saw it move against the wind once, rolling inland, curling through the dunes. He quit the next day and didn't even pick up his final paycheck. I kept going back, not out of bravery, but out of a pull I couldn't shake. It felt like unfinished business, like the fog had attached itself to me when it first said my name. One night I went alone. No lantern, no rod, just my boots and the wide beach beneath a sliver of moon. The air was still. the gulf as flat as a sheet of iron. Then I smelled it, the sulfur, and the mist rose all at once, so fast I couldn't see my own hands. The voices came louder this time, a chorus instead of whispers. Every tone I'd ever known weaving through, some belonging to the living, some to the dead. They begged, they pleaded, some sweet, some cruel. I felt something tugging at my wrist, invisible but insistent, and when I pulled back, the force tightened until my skin burned. The fog thickened, pressing against my chest, filling my throat until I couldn't breathe. I ran, crashing through wet sand I couldn't see, stumbling toward what I prayed was the highway. The voices chased me, calling my name sharper now, almost angry, like I was breaking some pact. My boots sank, the ground softening as though the beach itself wanted me down. Then, just when I thought my lungs would split, I broke free into the open night air. Behind me, the fog rolled back toward the sea as if it had never been. I collapsed on the shoulder of the highway, retching, my skin smelling like sulfur for days after. I never went back, though sometimes at night, even miles inland, I swear I smell that same bitter rot curling through my windows. And sometimes when I lie awake listening to the wind, I hear my mother's voice calling my name with that same stretched-out sorrow, asking me why I ran when I was so close. I think about those fishermen whose rods were found neatly placed, about how maybe they didn't run fast enough. And I know deep down that one night the black fog will come inland for me, rolling in without wind, carrying voices I cannot resist. And when it does, I don't think I'll run again. The fire scars of Bastrop State Park stretch for miles, blackened pines jutting like skeletal fingers against the Texas sky, a reminder of the inferno that tore through years ago. Trails wind through the regrowth where cedar sprouts claw at the charred soil and silence hangs heavier than the heat. It was in this emptiness that a group of hikers stumbled on something no one expected to find. It wasn't on any map, not even the ranger station's detailed grid of campsites and restricted zones. The cabin appeared as if it had grown out of the ruin, crouched in a hollow where the forest looked dead longest, as if the fire had lingered there. Its roof sloped low, shingles mottled with ash and moss, walls black as though scorched but whole, refusing to collapse. There were no windows, not one, just the solid faces of wood, sweating resin in the sun, broken only by a single door, warped and dark as a coffin lid. At first, the group thought it must have been an old fire crew station, abandoned after the blaze, but the closer they came, the stranger it seemed. The ground around it was swept bare, no weeds, no fallen branches, almost as if something kept it cleared. The smell shifted as they circled it, not the normal pine sap or earth, but something faintly chemical, like charred varnish mixed with rust. One of them rapped on the wall with a knuckle and said it sounded hollow, but the sound died so fast it was like the cabin swallowed it. When they found the door, they saw the nails first, not on the outside, but wedged deep into the frame from the inside, hammered so hard the wood splintered outward. Someone had sealed themselves in. The hikers looked at each other, debating whether to touch it, and then one shoved hard. The door creaked, resisted, then gave way into blackness. The air that poured out was stale and cold despite the Texas sun, carrying the scent of mildew and something sweetly rotting. They shined a flashlight inside and froze. Every piece of furniture, chairs, a narrow bed frame, a heavy wooden table, was bolted into the floor. They weren't just old fixtures either. The bolts were new, gleaming dully in the beam. The door they had pushed open was thicker than it looked, with a chain lock welded into the wood, not screwed but welded, as though whoever built this place wanted to make sure nothing ever left once it was inside. Dust coated everything, but not the kind that comes from years of stillness. It was disturbed in strange streaks, like someone had dragged their fingers through it not long ago. In the far corner stood a second door, smaller, almost like a closet, but it too was nailed shut from the inside, the planks split from frantic hammering. One of the hikers swore they heard something shift behind it, like cloth brushing wood. There were no windows to let in light, only the beams of their flashlights cutting through the dark. One hiker whispered that the cabin wasn't on any records, and that much was true. At the ranger station, every shelter and ruin had been cataloged after the fire. They would have seen this on the board, but none of them had. The silence inside pressed down on them, thick as tar. They tried to laugh it off, saying maybe it was a poacher's hideout or some hermit's bunker. But the more they looked, the less sense it made. A journal lay on the bolted table, its pages warped and damp. The words inside had bled into unreadable stains, except for a handful near the back. Don't open the floor. That was when one of them noticed the seams. The cabin's floor wasn't solid. It was planked in sections with iron rings set into the wood. Traps like cellar doors, but flush enough to trip over if you weren't careful. They crouched and pulled, and though the boards groaned, they shifted. Air hissed up from the crack, colder, wetter, carrying that same sweet rot. The beam of a flashlight fell into darkness, then onto something pale. It wasn't stone or wood. It was softer, swollen, like flesh left too long in water. They dropped the board back with a slam, hearts pounding. The sound that came after was not imagined. A thud, heavy and deliberate, echoed from beneath the floor. Something had moved down there. Something large enough to rattle the furniture despite the bolts. The hikers bolted out the door, slamming it shut behind them, not caring about the nails or the chains. The silence of the burned forest outside felt alive now, as if the blackened trees leaned closer to listen. They didn't stop running until the trail markers appeared, and when they told the rangers what they had found, the men in uniforms frowned and said there were no cabins out that way, not anymore. They even pulled out the maps and showed the blank stretch where the hikers swore it stood. But when they returned later with the rangers in tow, the hollow was empty. No walls, no roof, not even the clear patch of earth. Just charred pines and weeds. Weeks later, back in town, one of the hikers woke to find scratches on their bedroom floor. Deep grooves shaped like rings, as if something beneath had been prying up from below. Another said they heard hammering in their sleep, nails being driven again and again from the inside out. None of them ever hiked Bastrop again. The cabin had vanished, but what they let loose when they opened the floor never seemed to leave. The woods around Martin Dice Jr. State Park are thick and tangled, the kind of place where shadows seem to lean in even under the sun. On that late September afternoon, a group of 4 campers, 2 couples from Beaumont, had gone off trail, chasing what they thought might be a shortcut back toward the river. They had only meant to shave a mile off their hike, but as the pine and cypress pressed in around them, and the sounds of the official trail disappeared, they stumbled into a silence that made the world feel abandoned. Then they saw it. The freezer sat at the edge of a small clearing, half sunk into the dirt as if the earth had been trying to swallow it for years. White once, though the metal had long ago dulled to a mottled gray, it looked wrong there among the trees. The handle was wrapped tight in loops of barbed wire, rusty barbs pinched against metal as though someone had wanted to make sure no one ever opened it again. One of the campers, a guy named Ray, circled it and muttered, "What the hell is this doing way out here?" His girlfriend Denise said nothing. She just stared at the freezer like it was a grave marker. They should have left it alone. They should have turned back right then. But curiosity has a way of outweighing common sense, especially when there's the thrill of discovery involved. The wire was brittle from years of rain, and Ray worked it loose, ignoring the pricks it left across his fingers. When he lifted the lid, a smell rose up that was more than rot. It was thick, clinging like scorched meat left too long on a grill, and beneath it a metallic sting that made their eyes water. Inside, the walls were slick with something dark, a tar-like coating that glistened wet under the fading light. At first, no one spoke. Denise gagged and turned away. The other couple, Brad and Kelly, whispered that it must have been used to store animals, maybe hunters hiding their kills. But the smell wasn't animal, and when Ray leaned closer, against every sane instinct he had, he swore he saw drag marks in the slick. Long finger-width grooves clawed down the inside wall as though something had tried to climb out. He slammed the lid shut, but the smell lingered in his nose, lodged in the back of his throat like he'd swallowed it. That night, back at their campsite, the woods felt different. The normal sounds, the frogs, the crickets, the distant shuffle of raccoons were muted as if muffled under a heavy blanket. Denise kept insisting she heard something behind their tent, a dragging noise like someone pulling a wet sack across the dirt. Ray tried to laugh it off, but he couldn't stop picturing those claw marks. When the fire dwindled, none of them wanted to sleep, but exhaustion always wins eventually. Sometime past midnight, Brad woke to a sound outside. Heavy breathing, steady and low. He thought it was a hog at first until he saw the shadow stretching against the nylon wall. Too tall, too deliberate. The breathing grew closer, and then the sound of something wet tapping against the tent fabric. He whispered for Kelly, but when she stirred, the sound stopped. By morning, there was nothing outside but damp leaves. Only, when they packed up, they noticed streaks of dark residue across their cooler, smeared as if by a soaking hand. They left early, cutting the trip short. The freezer was never reported. They didn't want the hassle, didn't want to explain why they had gone off trail. But Denise couldn't sleep after that. Not in her own apartment. Not with the hum of her refrigerator in the kitchen. She said, it sounded too much like a freezer humming to life. Like the one they found, though they all knew it hadn't been plugged in. Ray brushed it off until one night he came home and found her standing in front of their fridge with the door open. She was crying and whispering, "It's empty, it's empty," even though it wasn't. Weeks later, Kelly swore she saw someone standing at the tree line behind her duplex just before dawn. She said the figure was pale and dripping, like it had just crawled out of something cold and wet. Brad didn't believe her, at least not out loud, but he started waking up with the sheets damp, as if someone had dragged a wet body across their bed while they slept. Ray was the first to vanish. His truck was found abandoned on a service road near the park, driver's side door open, keys still in the ignition. The police assumed he wandered into the woods drunk or high, but Denise knew better. She told anyone who would listen that he'd gone back, that he'd been pulled back to where they found it. She said the freezer wasn't empty anymore, that it was waiting. The others started avoiding her calls. Then Kelly stopped showing up for work. Brad told friends she'd gone to stay with family in Dallas, but no one could confirm that. A month later, his body turned up in the Nishes River, bloated and waterlogged, though his lungs weren't full of water. The coroner said it was as if he had drowned somewhere else, something colder, then been left there. Denise disappeared last. Her apartment smelled like rust when the landlord finally opened it. The fridge stood unplugged, its door hanging wide. Inside, only streaks of something dark coated the walls. The police noted the similarity, though none of it made the news. Stories like that don't make tourists feel safe in state parks. If you hike off trail near Martin Dice Jr. long enough, people say you might come across a small clearing, though no map marks it. The freezer will still be there, its lid sealed again with new barbed wire, as if the forest itself wants to keep it shut. Some swear if you get close, you'll hear breathing from inside, slow and patient, like something waiting for someone foolish enough to open the lid again. And those who do never seem to stay gone long. They come back dripping wet and cold to the touch, looking for company to share the dark. The families who camped in Dinosaur Valley always came for the same thing. The peace of being tucked away in that stretch of limestone hills, the quiet rustle of pecan trees along the Paluxy River, the dinosaur tracks baked into the stone like scars from a world that refused to die. By day it was sunlit and inviting, a place where children clambered over boulders and fathers hauled coolers from pickup trucks, but by night it changed. The crickets grew louder, the air heavier, and the ridges swallowed the moonlight until the campsites felt like islands adrift in a black sea. That summer, people started waking to find their tents moved, dragged across gravel and dirt, the stakes ripped out clean, scrape marks gouged deep as if something huge had taken hold and pulled. At first it was laughed off, blamed on pranks, or drunken wanderers, but then it kept happening, and the marks grew longer, deeper, as though whatever was doing the pulling was growing more confident. The Johnson family had set up close to the riverbank one Friday evening. The father, Mark, hammered the stakes in until his palms blistered, driving them deep into the hard ground because he'd read the stories online and wanted no part of waking up on the other side of the park. His wife laughed at him for being paranoid, but he'd seen the pictures others had posted. Straight drag lines, disturbed earth, tents tilted at angles like storm wreckage. That night they cooked hot dogs and roasted marshmallows, while the cicadas screamed in the trees, and by midnight the fire was down to embers and the kids were snoring inside their nylon cocoon. Mark sat a while longer in a folding chair, sipping his beer, scanning the darkness. The trees shifted with the windless night, not moving, not bending, but seeming to lean closer. He finally zipped himself in beside his wife, telling himself the ground was too dry, too hard for anything to leave marks. Sometime around 3 he woke to a sound that wasn't quite scraping, wasn't quite dragging, but more like something thick brushing the dirt, a dull friction that vibrated through the floor of the tent. At first he thought it was one of the kids thrashing in their sleep, but when he reached out, both were still, their breathing steady. Then he realized the tent was moving. It was so subtle he thought he was dreaming. But then he felt the shift in his gut. The way the ground beneath him seemed to slide. His wife stirred and whispered his name, her voice pinched with confusion. And in that moment, the whole tent lurched forward like it had been hooked and yanked. The poles groaned, the fabric shivered, and the stakes ripped out one after the other like fingernails snapping. The kids woke screaming as the tent pitched and dragged, their bodies thrown against each other. Mark scrambled for the zipper, but the whole structure tilted sideways, the floor tugging against his knees. He could hear the earth tearing outside, long furrows cut into the dirt. When he finally forced the flap open and shoved his family out, the night air stank of damp clay, sharp and sour, and the ground around them was carved with two deep grooves, parallel, leading back into the darkness of the tree line. They looked like trenches dug by something impossibly wide. The tent sat 10 yards from where he'd hammered it down, its nylon scraped raw. There was no sound now but their own heaving breaths and the low hiss of the river. Other families reported the same in the following weeks. Some claimed they'd woken outside their tents entirely, sprawled on the cold dirt with no memory of crawling out. Others swore they'd seen shadows crouched low, huge but hunched, dragging the fabric with both arms like predators pulling prey into cover. Rangers dismissed it as coyotes or overactive imaginations. But then a couple from Fort Worth disappeared. Their site was found with both tents collapsed and torn, food left out on the table, a cooler tipped over, but no sign of them. The scrape. Marks led 30 yards into the woods before stopping dead, as if whatever had taken them had stepped off the face of the earth. The locals started telling stories about the Paluxy, about the old tales of bones that weren't just dinosaurs, about shapes people saw moving under the water when the moon was high. They spoke of the ground itself shifting, the rock remembering things that once walked there and wanting them back. The air grew heavier with each retelling and fewer families came. The ones who still braved it left before nightfall, refusing to sleep under canvas where the earth might tug them away like toys. One last story trickled through that summer, about a boy who refused to leave after his family packed up. He wanted to prove it was all just stories, that nothing could move him. He staked his little pup tent down with steel rods he'd bought at a hardware store, hammered them until his palms bled. They found the tent the next morning dragged halfway. Into the river, the rods bent like wire, the fabric shredded. The boy was gone. Only the scrape marks remained, gouged so deep into the limestone they glistened with water, as though the stone itself had been peeled open. And when the rangers tried to fill them in, the marks returned the next day, fresh and wet, stretching farther into the valley like something was still pulling, still hungry and still moving in the dark. The stories that float around Colorado Bend State Park usually start with something ordinary, like a night hike. People bring flashlights, headlamps, bottles of water, and a sense of adventure. The park is beautiful after dark in its own dangerous way. The trails winding through limestone cliffs and mesquite scrub. The Colorado River cutting silent in the distance. Most hikers talk about the bats in Gorman Cave or the stars over Spicewood Springs. But the regulars, the ones who live close to Bend or Lampasas, tell another story. It begins with a figure at the top of a cliff dressed in white, standing as still as stone. They call her the woman on the overlook. It isn't every night. Sometimes she's not there for months. But hikers who go out after sunset, especially in the thin sliver between midnight and 3 in the morning, swear they see her. She stands on the edge of a limestone bluff that drops sheer into the river basin below. She doesn't move, doesn't sway, doesn't even look like she's breathing. People describe her dress in different ways. Some say it's like a wedding gown, others a long nightgown yellowed with age. But they always agree it's white, glowing faintly even when the moon is hidden. She never jumps. She just waits at the edge as if listening to something far below. The dangerous part isn't seeing her. It's looking too long. That's what people warn about. One hiker from Austin said he froze, staring at her silhouette, and felt a pull inside his chest like he was leaning forward even though he wasn't moving. He snapped out of it when his buddy grabbed his arm, but for weeks afterward he had dreams of falling. Not just falling off cliffs, but off bridges, downstairs, even into the shower drain. Another woman from San Saba said she thought the figure was just some camper dressed up as a prank, until she met its eyes. Or thought she did. She said the world tipped sideways, her vision tunneled, and she couldn't breathe until her boyfriend shined his flashlight in her face. She didn't sleep right for nearly a month. Locals who know the story connect it to a woman from the early 1900s. They say she was a rancher's wife who disappeared one summer. Her husband claimed she fell into the river trying to fetch water, but the town whispered darker things. The sheriff's records from that time are thin, but the name most often mentioned is Lila Mae Green. Her grave in Bend Cemetery is marked only with a date and no explanation, as if even then people were afraid to put words to what happened. Hikers today don't need the history, though. They feel it when they see her. A man named Richard from Burnett went out with 2 friends for a night hike along the river trail. They spotted her figure on the bluff near Lemon's Ridge and dared each other to climb up for a closer look. Richard was the only one who got close enough to see the shape of her face. He said it was pale and soft like wet clay, with no features except a faint crease where a mouth might be. He tried to scream, but nothing came out. His friends dragged him back, cursing at him for scaring them, but Richard couldn't explain the dreams that followed. For nearly 6 weeks, he woke in the middle of the night with his body jerking upward, as if he'd just hit the bottom of a fall that never ended. Others have it worse. A college group from San Marcos went up there once, half drunk, daring each other to shine lights at her. They said the beam cut right through the figure like fog, but the girl holding the flashlight fainted on the spot. She didn't wake until the next morning, and when she did, she swore she had spent hours plunging through black air, arms flailing, unable to scream. She dropped out of school the next semester. The park rangers never write anything official. They chalk it up to exhaustion, heat, or alcohol, but off record they admit they've seen her too. One ranger who worked the park for 20 years told a friend in town that the first time he saw her, he thought she was a suicidal camper. He ran to the overlook yelling for her to step back, but when he reached the edge, she was gone. The ground was damp where she had been standing, even though it hadn't rained in weeks. That night he dreamed he was falling into the river gorge, smashing against rocks, lungs filling with water. The dream came every night for a month, and he said it felt real enough that he woke with bruises on his ribs. The most disturbing part of the story is that no one ever reports her jumping. People watch her, hold their breath waiting, and she never moves. But those who see her long enough swear that their balance tilts. Even when they leave the park, even days later, they'll be walking on flat ground and suddenly feel a lurch, as if the floor dropped beneath them. A few say they hear rushing water in their ears when there isn't any around. Some say they can still see her in flashes when they close their eyes at night. Her figure cut in white against the cliff's edge, waiting without motion. What scares the locals isn't that she stands there, it's what she might be waiting for. Some believe she's looking for someone to join her, not to push, not to chase, but to pull gently with the weight of gravity. The promise of the fall. They say once you've looked too long, she already has you, and it's just a matter of time before your feet slip in some ordinary place and you go over the edge. Whether it's a balcony, a bridge, or a roadside cliff. A man named Carlos, who grew up near Lampasas, went missing last year after camping at the park. His truck was found in the lot by the trailhead, his tent still rolled in the back seat untouched. Friends said he had been obsessed with the overlook for weeks, sketching cliffs in his notebook, talking about how the figure looked peaceful, almost inviting. He wasn't the first to vanish, but he was the most recent. Some think he finally looked too long, and the fall he'd been dreaming about claimed him when no one else was watching. The strange part is that when you stand on the overlook yourself, even in daylight, you understand. The wind pushes at your shoulders, the river hums below, and the space between you and the air feels thinner than it should. Your eyes linger on the drop longer than they should. And if you're unlucky enough to go at night, you might see her standing there already, white against the black, waiting for you to look too long. Because it isn't just about seeing her. It's about the echo that follows. The dream that digs into your nights. The way your balance shifts even on steady ground. People say the real danger isn't that she's up there waiting. The real danger is that once you've seen her, part of you starts waiting too. The Franklin Mountains stretch across the western edge of Texas like a spine of jagged stone, cutting the desert sky into sharp ridges that seem older than time itself. At their highest point, wind scours the cliff so fiercely it feels like a voice, thin and hollow, carrying something unearthly across the rocks. Hikers who push beyond the marked trails sometimes talk about the tower, a fire watch outpost built decades ago, perched on a rise where you can see El Paso to the south and endless desert to the north. Official maps don't mark it anymore. The Forest Service sealed it in 1981 after the last man stationed there vanished. Some claim they still see him, waving from the balcony when dusk turns the desert purple. His name was Dale Merritt, though most who talk about him don't remember it. They just call him the Forgotten Firewatch. The road that winds through the mountains is narrow, twisting between outcrops and dry gullies. It's lonely after dark, when headlights sweep over boulders that look like hunched figures waiting to step onto the asphalt. A teacher named Clara first reported the waving man in 1992. She told rangers she was driving home after a late hike when her eyes caught movement on the ridge. A figure in uniform raised his arm in a slow, deliberate gesture, not frantic but insistent, as if flagging her down. She pulled over, got out, and squinted against the fading sun. The tower looked skeletal, its windows boarded. The metal stairs rusted to streaks of orange. Still, she swore she saw someone up there, standing perfectly still after the wave. When rangers checked the next morning, the padlock on the base door was intact, the dust on the stairs undisturbed. They told her it was a trick of the light, but Clara never returned to those trails again. Stories layered after hers. A pair of college kids camping near the base swore they heard boots on the rocks at night, slow and heavy, circling their tent until the crunch of gravel stopped right at the flap. When they unzipped it, the desert was empty. Others said they hiked up to the tower and found the door chained but could smell smoke inside, like wet cedar smoldering. The strangest account came from a border patrol officer who stopped near the ridge to scan with binoculars. He said he saw not one but two figures on the balcony. The first waved. The second leaned against the railing, face shadowed, and whispered something he could not hear, though his ears filled with it. A week later, the officer quit his post without explanation, packed up, and left the state. His report was buried in files no one bothered to release. Dale's disappearance itself was quiet but unsettling. Official records said he radioed in at 11:03 p.m. on an August night, confirming visibility across the desert was clear, no signs of smoke or fire. His voice carried a strain, though the transcript didn't capture it. He never called again. At sunrise, a relief ranger hiked up to relieve him and found the tower locked, the keyring still hooked on the outside latch, as if Dale had never gone inside. But the lantern on the balcony was still burning, its flame low but steady. His bedroll was folded, his lunch tin washed clean, and his boots gone. Only the boots. No prints in the dust around the base, no marks leading away. The investigation ended with the word inconclusive. That was the summer the service boarded it up, citing structural safety. But some say when you stand at the locked door, you can hear someone inside pacing, dragging boot heels across wood. In recent years, locals have grown wary of mentioning the tower aloud. Hikers say the more you talk about it, the more likely you are to catch sight of the waving ranger. A mechanic named Jose told his nephew about it over beers, laughing, calling it campfire nonsense. That week, driving home late, he saw a figure waving from the ridge. He almost waved back before realizing the uniform was too crisp, too clean for a man who should have rotted 40 years in the desert. He sped off without looking again. His nephew said Jose woke 3 nights straight to find sand scattered across his bedroom floor, and the faint smell of smoke clinging to his sheets. The fire tower itself is visible if you know the angle. Half hidden by rock, its beams stark against the sky. Those who hike near it swear the desert grows quieter, like even insects hold their breath. One woman said she heard her own name whispered from the balcony, though she was alone. Another claimed she climbed as far as the locked door, and through the crack in the board saw a lantern swinging slowly as if moved by a hand. She ran, convinced someone was inside, but the lock was rusted shut, unmoved for decades. And when she returned weeks later, her camera malfunctioned near the ridge, every photo taken of the tower blurring into static haze, while the rest of the desert captured clear. If you linger long enough, they say the waving changes. At first it's casual, the kind of greeting a ranger might give a passing hiker. But if you keep watching, the hand lowers, stiffens, and begins to beckon instead, slow, deliberate curls of the fingers asking you closer. Those who stare too long dream of climbing stairs that never end, circling upward through shadows where each step echoes like a hollow drum. Some wake with sand under their nails, their sheets damp with the smell of rain on dust. One man swore he woke on his own front porch, bare feet cut and raw as if he had walked across stone all night. The Franklin Mountains have swallowed men before. Lost hikers, collapsed miners, stranded travelers. But the tower carries a different weight, a silence that is not natural. When the wind cuts across the rocks, it sometimes carries with it the faint crackle of radio static, and a voice almost too soft to be real calling in a report. The words garbled but steady. Those who hear it describe a feeling that someone is watching not from the tower, but from behind them. Too close, waiting for them to turn. The last official notice about the tower came in 2004, when a survey team flagged it as unstable, at risk of collapse. Yet it still stands stubborn against the desert storms. No one has dared dismantle it. The rumor is the last man who proposed tearing it down was killed in a freak rock slide, only days after signing the paperwork. His body was found pinned, face turned toward the tower, mouth full of sand. Since then, the service pretends it doesn't exist, maps revised, paths rerouted. But hikers still find it, and some still see him waving, his arm lifting with a patience that should not belong to the dead. And if you ever drive the narrow road at dusk, when the horizon bleeds into night and the rocks glow with dying heat, keep your eyes forward. Do not search the ridges. Do not look for movement against the sky. Because if you meet the ranger's gesture and let yourself acknowledge him, you may find yourself waking in the desert with dust in your lungs and the echo of boots pacing just above your head, in a tower that should have been empty for more than 40 years. The first time I heard it, I thought a coyote had gotten itself trapped under the stone bridge. That was my mind's first excuse, and even then it didn't sit right, because there was nothing about that sound that matched anything living I'd ever known. It was after midnight and Onion Creek was running low, which meant the current crawled slow and shallow across the limestone shelves. But beneath the bridge it deepened into a dark pool that never showed its bottom. I was parked on the shoulder, windows down because the air was still heavy with summer heat, and I heard it echo. It wasn't on the land. It wasn't in the trees. It came from under the water, as if something down there had a voice that refused to be drowned. I cut my engine and got out. The bridge sat low, built thick and heavy from blocks of pale limestone stained dark at the edges by decades of rain. The creek ran right under its belly. From where I stood, the moonlight showed little ripples, nothing violent, nothing to match the way that sound had clawed the air. I leaned against the rail and waited, trying to convince myself I'd misheard it. But then it came again, this time longer, rising into a high-pitched cry that slid down into something guttural, like an animal tearing itself open. My flashlight beam broke the water into silvery shards but revealed nothing beneath. The noise stopped as quickly as it had started, leaving me alone with the hiss of crickets and the thrum of blood in my ears. The next morning I told myself to forget it, but the sound lived in me. I've been around McKinney Falls for years, and you get used to its moods. You hear the owls, the coyotes, sometimes even feral pigs that roam in the night. You know what drowning cicadas sound like when they get too close to the water. But this had none of that familiarity. This was shaped deliberate. It carried a weight that made me feel like it knew I was listening. I didn't talk about it with anyone because I didn't want the looks people give when you start sounding superstitious. But I kept going back. The second time it happened, I was standing on the bridge itself. Midnight had passed and the park was closed. I'd made sure I was alone. I leaned on the warm limestone rail and looked into the black oval beneath. The creek carried only the faintest glow from the thin slice of moon. That was when the sound came again, louder this time, close enough that it felt like it was crawling up through the stone into my bones. It started thin and sharp, then widened into a roar, echoing under the arch until the bridge itself seemed to breathe with it. The water rippled outward as if something had moved below, but the surface stayed unbroken. No fish, no animal, nothing. I staggered back and my boot heel scraped against the pavement, the noise loud in the silence. The cry cut off instantly, like whatever had made it had been startled by me. My throat was dry, my skin damp. I remember thinking that water shouldn't be able to hold sound like that. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was a pipe under the bridge. Maybe kids had rigged up some prank, a speaker hidden in the stone. But when I went back in daylight and walked down the bank, crawling under the arch to look, all I found was limestone slick with algae, water pooling in pockets, the smell of wet earth. There was nowhere to hide anything. No pipes, no equipment, just the creek flowing slow, whispering over the rocks. I pressed my palm to the stone wall and it was cold. Colder than it should have been after hours of Texas sun. Something about that chill unsettled me more than the scream had. I started asking around, quiet at first, not wanting to seem obsessed. A ranger who'd been working the park for 20 years told me sometimes people reported strange cries at night, but he shrugged it off as coyotes or feral cats. Then he looked me in the eye and said if I heard anything under that bridge, the best thing I could do was walk away. He said it flat, no humor, and then changed the subject. That stayed with me, but I didn't walk away. I couldn't. Each night I found myself back at that spot waiting. The howling came irregularly, sometimes right after midnight, sometimes closer to 2. Every time it rose, the water shifted. I noticed bubbles once, faint at first, then more, as though something deep below had exhaled. The sound seemed to climb up through those bubbles, shaped by the current, pushed through the arch until it scraped the inside of my skull, and always when it reached its peak it felt almost human. Not exactly words, but the cadence of language, a pleading tone that sent my stomach into knots. The dream started after my 4th night out there. I dreamed I was under the bridge, pressed into the cold stone as water filled my lungs. The scream was all around me, deafening, and I tried to swim up, but the surface kept pulling away, receding as if the creek had no end. I'd wake soaked in sweat, gasping, convinced water was still in my chest. Even during the day, if I passed by a drain or heard running water, I swore I caught echoes of the cry, faint but there, waiting. I told myself I'd stop, that it was getting into my head. But the pull was stronger than my fear. One night I brought a small recorder, set it on the rail, and waited. The scream came at 12:47, long and sharp, bursting upward until it fractured into a deep growl. When I played it back later, the recording didn't just capture sound. There was a distortion, a low rumble beneath it, like the grinding of stone. And under that, almost hidden, I thought I heard words. Not clear, but syllables, gasps, something like help. I deleted the file. I couldn't keep it. Some things feel wrong to carry into daylight. I started noticing other signs. A fisherman I spoke to swore he heard a woman crying from under the bridge at dawn, but when he ran to look, there was nothing but still water. A family camping nearby told me their dog refused to cross the bridge at night, whining and pulling back until they had to carry it. Another couple swore they saw shapes in the water, like pale hands just beneath the surface, but when they leaned closer, the creek was empty. Each story made my stomach sink because it meant it wasn't just me. By late summer, I wasn't sleeping much. My nights belonged to that bridge. One evening, the air was thick with heat, no wind at all. The kind of night where even the insects seemed exhausted. I leaned against the rail and told myself I'd leave as soon as I heard it again, but this time it didn't come from under the arch. It came from directly beneath my feet, rising straight through the stone. The bridge shook faintly, dust falling from the joints in the limestone. The scream stretched longer than ever, so long that my chest tightened as if it was draining air from me, and then in the last second I heard it shape my name. Not perfectly, but close enough that I staggered back, heart hammering, the night spinning around me. I didn't go back for a week. I told myself it was finished, that I'd leave it behind. But that sound has a way of finding you once you've heard it. In my apartment, the pipes groaned at night, carrying a faint echo of it. I'd run the shower and swear the steam carried whispers. Even in silence, I'd hear it behind my ears, the low rumble rising. I finally realized it wasn't the bridge calling me back. It was the water. And water is everywhere. On the last night I went, the creek was swollen from recent rain, the current rougher, darker. I stood on the bridge, palms pressed to the stone rail, and the howling started before midnight, cutting straight through the rush of water. It was louder than I'd ever heard, deep and layered, the voices of animals and people all tangled together. It rose until my teeth vibrated, until I felt the stone itself was trembling. And again, through it all, I heard my name, clear this time, shaped perfectly. The surface below rippled, bubbles rising in a wide circle, and for the first time I saw movement. Something pale rolled beneath, too large to be a fish, too human to be dismissed. It turned once, showing a hand, then slipped back into the dark. The scream followed it down, fading until the only sound left was the creek rushing on. I don't know why I'm writing this. Maybe to leave proof, maybe to convince myself it's real. I haven't gone back to the bridge since, but the sound hasn't left me. At night I hear it in the walls, in the hum of the refrigerator, in the gurgle of every drain. Sometimes it calls my name. Sometimes it doesn't need to because I already know it's waiting. The low stone bridge at McKinney Falls will keep echoing with that howl long after I'm gone. And anyone who leans too close to the rail, anyone who listens too long, will understand that what screams beneath the water isn't asking for help. It's asking you to join it. The first thing you noticed out there in the big thicket wasn't the darkness, though. God knows that patch of Texas holds the kind of night that swallows headlights and swallows you with them. No, the first thing was the weight of the silence, heavier than it should have been, like the woods had learned to breathe in unison and were holding it all in, waiting. People will tell you that place is alive, more alive than it has any right to be, and sometimes it doesn't want you there. Folks come for the camping, the hunting, or just to lose themselves. But if you talk long enough to someone who spent real time in those pines, you'll hear it. The story of the white bus that runs that old dirt road after dark. No lights, no engine sound, just the crunch of wheels on gravel. And when it passes, everything else in the forest goes still. Like even the crickets and owls don't dare make a noise until it's gone. There was a man named Harris who came down from Dallas with a brand new tent and the sort of restless spirit that drives people into places they don't understand. He wasn't much for legends, not then. Not when he first pulled into the campsite off the county road with his cooler full of beer and his dog that wouldn't stop whining as soon as the sun went down. He thought it was the scent of hogs in the brush, maybe coyotes. But as the night fell thicker, that dog pressed flat against the truck door and wouldn't move, staring at the tree line with eyes gone wide and glassy. Harris cursed, pulled another beer, and told himself he'd laugh about it come morning. Around midnight, though, the forest did something it never should. It shut up all at once. No night birds, no cicadas, no wind even. Just a suffocating stillness that pressed in on him so hard he could hear his own heartbeat. That's when the rumble came. Not the way a truck or bus should sound. Not the strain of an engine, but a deep grinding like wheels too heavy for the earth rolling across the road. His fire was low, just glowing red coals, but it was enough to throw shadows against the pines when the shape came sliding past. Long, pale, boxy, and wrong. The skeleton of a school bus, stripped of color but not of form. Its windows hollow black and its headlights dead sockets. It didn't throw dust when it rolled, though he swore he saw the wheels turn, crunching gravel that left no mark. It moved slow enough that he could see through the empty windows, slow enough that for one impossible second, he thought he saw faces pressed against the glass, blurred and pale, their mouths working like they were screaming without sound. Then it was gone, swallowed by the road, leaving behind silence so total it seemed to choke his lungs. The dog never made a sound. When Harris looked back at the truck, the animal was gone. Leash snapped clean through, no paw prints, nothing. Just the mark of its nails dug into the dirt by the tire. He never found that dog, though he searched until dawn. By then he was swearing to anyone who'd listen that he must have dreamed it. But the leash was still frayed, his fire was still cold, and the road still carried no tracks. Other campers told their stories too, though none liked to linger on them. A young couple swore they heard children's voices drifting from the road, soft laughter cutting through the trees like it was just out of sight. When the bus passed them, the man said he felt a pressure in his chest so hard it made him drop to his knees, like something had shoved him down, and his girlfriend's face was streaked with tears she didn't remember shedding. An old hunter told of following the bus's path one night, stubborn and half-drunk, convinced it was some local trick or backroads ride. He walked 2 miles of that dirt road under a moonless sky and swore the bus always stayed just ahead of him, not moving faster, not falling back, just drifting where his lantern couldn't reach. He turned back when he noticed the woods on either side of him had grown so quiet that even his boots on the gravel didn't make a sound. What's strange is how the stories always end the same way. Not with an accident, not with death or screaming, but with a kind of erasure. People find their dogs missing, their phones drained of charge, their watches stopped at the same minute. One boy said he blacked out after chasing the bus and woke up with mud caked on his arms like he'd been dragged down into the marsh. Another man claimed his truck had been shifted 20 feet sideways in the night. Wheels sunk deep in the earth like something too large had pushed it aside. None of them talk about seeing it again. It only passes once for each of them, like a warning, or maybe a choice. Some say the white bus is just the bones of something old left to rot in those woods. A vehicle that carried kids to a school long since forgotten, its rusted shell burned away by time until only the shadow of it remains. Others whisper darker things, that it's no relic at all but a vessel, something that hunts the edges of the thicket for souls that wander too far. They say the faces in the windows are real enough, that if you stand close when it passes and the silence closes in, you might just recognize someone you love staring back at you. But the rule is clear. Don't follow it, don't call out, and whatever you do, don't listen too long. Because silence in the big thicket isn't empty. It's waiting. And when the bus rolls past, carrying nothing and everything all at once, you'll know the woods aren't yours anymore. They never were. Harris never went back. He moved out west, told his friends the thicket was cursed, and flinched every time he heard the groan of a bus on the highway. But sometimes, late at night when he drove alone, He swore he saw headlights go dead in his rearview mirror, and the woods outside his window seemed to hold their breath. The sun was sliding low over Tyler State Park, the last orange rays burning across the tall pines and glimmering on the lake's calm skin. I was walking the trail that curled near the water's edge, breathing in the smell of cedar and damp soil when I saw it for the first time. A lantern, old and blackened like something you'd find in an antique shop, stood on the rocks at the shoreline. Its glass was fogged, but the flame inside danced bright, steady, and yellow against the gathering dusk. Nobody was around, and no fishing lines hung in the water nearby. The lantern was just there, glowing on its own, a little pool of light in the thickening dark. The oddest thing was the ground around it. The dirt was wet, darkened like someone had been standing there with boots dripping lake water. But there were no footprints, only the damp outline, a perfect circle of saturation. I thought maybe a camper had left it, though it seemed foolish. These woods had plenty of people passing through, and leaving behind an open flame didn't make sense. I kept walking, though I glanced back more than once, unsettled by how that glow seemed to pull at the eyes. By the time I looped around again, the lantern was gone. No trace of smoke, no dent in the dirt where it had been set down. Only the wet patch remained, sinking into the soil as though something had pressed long and heavy upon it. The second night I went looking. Some part of me told myself it was just curiosity, but it was more than that. That kind of thing sticks to your mind like a burr. At dusk I found it again, this time a few yards down the shore. The same lantern, the same steady flame, the same ring of wet earth beneath it, as though whatever carried it up from the water always left a trail of seepage. I crouched closer and listened. The woods were still, no frogs, no crickets, just the faint hiss of fire inside the glass. Then I heard the creak of something shifting, faint as the groan of wood, though nothing around me moved. I didn't sleep much that night. My thoughts churned over it, over the possibility that maybe someone came to the park each evening to set it there, though why and how it always vanished by dawn I couldn't explain. On the third evening I brought my brother Mark. We camped near the trail close enough to catch sight of the spot. Sure enough, at dusk there it was. The lantern shimmered across the water, its flame unyielding to the wind that stirred through the pines. Mark, ever the skeptic, walked ahead. He bent near it, even picked it up. His face glowed in the firelight, shadows stretching long across the ground. He smirked at me. "It's just a lamp," he said, shaking it gently. The light didn't waver. He set it back, muttering about spooked campers. We left it there, but neither of us said much the rest of the night. At dawn, we returned. The lantern was gone, but the damp circle remained. This time, though, the wet patch was larger, spreading in uneven streaks toward the tree line, as if something had shifted position or dragged itself backward into the woods. The soil smelled sour, like algae and rot. Mark joked about a prankster, but his tone was thin. He didn't camp with me again. I came back alone the next evening, drawn by something I couldn't shake. The lantern was waiting, nearer the water than before, so close the lapping waves nearly touched its base. The flame reflected in the rippling surface as though it wanted to be mirrored, doubled, pulled down into the depths. I crouched again, heart hammering in my chest. That's when I heard it, faint but unmistakable. Breathing. It came from beneath the water, slow and wet, as though lungs were straining to push air through a mouthful of mud. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root. The flame inside the lantern flared brighter, as if it had been fed by the sound. I left, forcing myself not to run, though every step away from the shore felt like something was pressing against my back. By the time I reached my truck, I swore I smelled the sour reek of algae clinging to my clothes. The next morning I dreamed of the lantern. Or maybe it was a memory that had warped into something more. I dreamed of standing at the lakeside, the lantern bright beside me. But instead of the wet patch on the ground, there was a figure. A shape. Tall, lanky, its limbs too long, slick and dripping as though carved from the lake's deepest muck. The lantern wasn't set down at all. It hung in its hand. Its other hand was reaching for me. I woke drenched in sweat, the smell of pond water in my nostrils. My boots, left by the tent flap, were wet as though I'd waded into the shallows. I didn't tell anyone after that. People wouldn't believe it, or they'd laugh it off the way Mark had. But I couldn't stop returning. I came back night after night, each time finding the lantern waiting at dusk. Each time its flame steady no matter the wind. Each time the wet soil growing darker, heavier, as though the earth itself was struggling to breathe beneath something pressing down. One night the lantern wasn't on the shore. It was farther out, standing in the water up to its base, the fire casting rings of gold across the ripples. I stood there for a long time, fighting the urge to wade in. The breathing was louder that night, pulling in and out of the water like the sigh of something vast and patient. When I turned to leave, I heard footsteps behind me, but when I spun around, the trail was empty. The last time I went, the lantern wasn't waiting at all. The shoreline was empty, the water calm. I thought maybe it had finally ended, that whatever had carried it each night had gone back under for good. I stood there until the sun dipped fully below the trees. That's when the flame blinked into life, not on the ground this time, but higher, hanging in the air at the height of a man's chest. The glass gleamed. The soil beneath my feet turned soft, spongy, soaking through my boots, and then I saw it. The silhouette standing a few yards ahead, darker than the trees behind it, holding the lantern at its side. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but the ground beneath it was slick and wet, spreading outward until it reached me. The smell was overwhelming. Swamp rot, dead fish, wet iron. My knees shook, and before I realized it, the flame inside the lantern went out, plunging me into blackness. When I came to, it was dawn. I was lying on the damp soil by the water. My boots were gone, set neatly beside me, lined up as though someone had placed them there. The earth all around was soaked in a perfect ring. I stumbled to my truck, heart in my throat. I haven't gone back since. But sometimes at night, when the wind rattles my windows, I catch a faint reflection in the glass. A lantern's glow, steady and patient, waiting for me to return. The night air at Lake Mineral Wells was the kind that pressed against the skin and carried smells sharper than they should have been. Pine sap and lake water mingling with the faint sourness of dried fish guts left near the dock. I had parked my camper on one of the gravel loops close to the water, the kind where the hookups hummed low and steady, and the air carried the occasional laugh or cough from neighboring RVs. It was the third night there, a Thursday, late enough in the season that the park wasn't full, just scattered lights glowing soft between the trees. That night I went to bed with the sound of cicadas buzzing in my ears, the red numbers of the camper clock glowing past midnight. I must have drifted hard because when I jolted awake, I wasn't sure what had done it. Then I heard it. 3 knocks, firm, slow, measured. Not a frantic pounding, not a drunken prank. Just knuckles on aluminum, steady as a hand knocking to be invited in. I lay there still, heart in my throat, waiting for it to come again. The clock read 3:33 a.m., the kind of exact time that feels wrong, like the numbers had been chosen instead of fallen into place. I told myself it was some teenager, some camper who had wandered the loops, but I couldn't imagine one of them being brave enough to knock at that hour. My hand hovered over the blinds, but I didn't look. Something in me said not to. The next morning, sunlight slid hot across the camper and I felt stupid. I checked the gravel outside the door, expecting footprints, scuffs, anything. But there was nothing but a faint shimmer of gasoline in the air, sharp enough to sting my nose. I checked the generator, checked the fuel can, but nothing was spilled. By noon, I had convinced myself it was all in my head, some half-dream. But when I went up to the camp store, I overheard an older couple talking to the clerk. They were pale, drawn. The woman kept her sunglasses on indoors, and her husband's hand shook as he signed his name to the receipt. They said someone had knocked on their camper at 3:33 a.m. too. When they opened the door, no one was there, just the smell, strong enough that they thought someone had doused the step with fuel. The clerk nodded slowly, like she had heard it before but wouldn't say more. That night I stayed awake, drinking coffee and watching the door. The minutes dragged until I was sure I'd imagined it all. But at 3:33 the knocks came again. 3, slow even. I snapped the blinds aside in one motion, expecting to catch a kid laughing, but there was nothing. Just the curve of the loop road, the shadows of the oaks, and that smell, like a gas station, had opened up inside my lungs. I stumbled outside barefoot, the gravel cutting my soles, but the night was still. No footsteps, no retreating figure. The other RVs were quiet, their shades drawn. I swore then I saw a flicker down by the water, not a flashlight but a dull, pulsing glow, low to the ground like a lantern. By the time I reached the dock, it was gone. The smell was worse there, clinging to the boards, heavy and sweet like rot under the gasoline. My stomach turned until I had to brace myself on the rail. When I looked down, the water was black. No stars reflected, no ripples, but I felt the distinct, Undeniable impression that someone was standing under the dock, inches beneath me, staring up. The days blurred after that. I tried to move to a different site, but the rangers' list showed them all booked, though I barely saw a soul. Every night the same thing, 3 knocks at 3:33. If I ignored them, they came louder the next night, shaking the thin aluminum skin. If I looked, the smell nearly drove me to my knees. One night I saw handprints on the door in the morning, faint smears like someone's palms had been soaked in oil. I scrubbed them until my skin blistered, but they never fully faded. On the 5th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the door wide as the knock sounded, let the cold air rush in. There was no one, but the smell was so strong it was choking. I heard movement by the picnic table, the scrape of wood on stone. When I stepped closer, I saw deep gouges in the surface, 3 lines running parallel, burned black into the grain. My flashlight flickered and died then, though the batteries had been fresh. In the dark, something whispered, too faint to make out except the rhythm matched the knocking. 3 words, 3 times. My chest burned as if the fumes were inside me now. I stumbled back into the camper, slamming the lock. I sat up until daylight, the words circling my skull, though I didn't know their meaning. By then I thought I was losing my mind. I tried to leave, packed everything, but when I turned the ignition, the engine wouldn't catch. Not a click, not a cough. Just silence, the smell of gasoline filling the cab, though the tank was sealed tight. I flagged down a ranger, a young man with sharp eyes, but when I told him, his face shifted. He leaned on the door and said quietly, almost like he was warning me rather than helping, "Don't answer again. Just don't." That was all he said before he left. That night I listened to the knocks without moving, without breathing. They kept coming over and over until dawn. On the 7th day I saw smoke rising from the far side of the lake. A ranger's truck sped past, lights off but moving fast. Later I heard the store clerk whispering to another camper that an RV had gone up in flames. They said the family inside never even came out, though their neighbors swore they saw them standing outside the night before, staring across the lake like they were waiting for someone. The clerk caught me watching and turned away, her mouth set in a hard line. When I walked back to my camper, the smell followed me, seeping into my clothes, into my skin. I left the park the next morning, towing the dead engine with a service truck. But the knocking hasn't stopped. 2 nights ago, parked in my own driveway, I woke at 3:33 to the sound of it, clear as ever. 3 knocks on the camper door, steady and patient, followed by that same gasoline stink pouring through the vents, the kind that lingers in your hair no matter how much you wash. I didn't answer. I won't, but I know one night I'll have to. I know because last night the knocking came from inside, from the cabinet by the bed, 3 sharp raps in the dark, as if whatever had been waiting outside the camper at Lake Mineral Wells had finally found a way in. The first time it happened to me was in late October, just as the leaves around the South Llano River were turning brittle, and the nights carried the kind of chill that bit through denim. I had been invited by my cousin to join a group of hunters from Junction. They weren't city boys, and neither was I, but I hadn't been out in the brush this far south for years. We parked our trucks along a ranch road, hiked in with rifles strapped across our shoulders, and pitched camp where the river cut a lazy bend through the cedar breaks. The air smelled of mesquite smoke from our small fire, and there was a kind of loneliness in the sound of the river sliding past in the dark that only men who've spent nights away from towns can recognize. It wasn't until after midnight that the first strange sound carried through the brush. We were sitting quiet, each of us nursing a drink. The fire burned down low to coals. From the stand of juniper across the river came a voice, clear as anything. Mike, just that. My cousin's name. He looked up fast like someone had called him from 5 feet away, but the sound came from deep in the timber, maybe 30 yards off. His face drained of color in the firelight. The others chuckled at first, thinking it was one of us playing around, but I swore on my father's grave no lips around that fire had moved. A minute later, another voice came. Only this time it was different, stretched thinner, more hollow, like wind forced through a pipe. Eddie, that was me. My scalp prickled. I swore I felt something step across my grave. My cousin, pale but stubborn, got to his feet and said he'd check it. The older men told him to sit his ass down, that coyotes could mimic and owls could sound near human if the night bent your ears right. But I saw the way his hands trembled as he kept staring across that black timberline. He couldn't shake it, and neither could I. The next morning we found boot tracks near the river where none of us had crossed. They led into the brush but faded after 10 yards. No one claimed them. The men grew uneasy, and by dusk most were set on moving camp farther up. I wanted the same, but my cousin was hard-headed, said he wasn't about to be spooked off prime hunting ground by some echoes in the dark. That night, lying in my bag with the fire smoldering low, I heard it again. Only this time it was my own voice. Not someone calling me, but me, clear as a bell, saying, "Eddie, over here." The sound came from the river's edge, low and husky, a perfect mimic. My heart pounded so loud I thought the others would hear. I clamped my hands to my ears, but it didn't matter. The words slid inside anyway, curling through my skull. By 3 in the morning, I realized my cousin was gone from his bag. No footsteps, no zipper noise, no nothing, just gone. We searched until sunup, calling his name through those cedar draws, but no answer ever came. When we finally found him, or what was left, it wasn't but a heap of his jacket and boots sitting neat on the gravel bar like he had stepped right out of them and walked barefoot into the brush. No tracks, no blood, nothing but that hollow river and the wind shifting through the breaks. The sheriff came, questions asked, statements written. The men swore coyotes or maybe a cougar had dragged him, but I knew better. The voice still curls in my ears when I close my eyes at night. They never found him. Men vanish along that river more often than folks admit, and each story carries a whisper about hearing your own voice or the voice of someone you love, luring you into the dark. Since then, I've avoided the South Llano, but the strange part is that the voice never really left me. Some nights far from those hills, when I'm alone and the clock creeps past 3, I hear it again outside my window. Not faint, not distant, close. It calls my name in my exact tone, urging me to follow. I never do. I'm afraid that if I answer, if I even speak a word back, it'll know I'm listening. And I fear that one night, just like my cousin, I won't be able to resist the hollow call, and when morning comes, there won't be anything left of me but a pair of boots lined up neatly by the door.